All right, Zoltanous here on Fascio Podcast, doing another episode. And as the co-host, we have Censored Anon. He dipped out of the chat for a second. Oh, there he is.
No, I'm right here.
Okay,
Hi,
sweet.
How's it going?
And today as our guests, we have the Hispaninistas, I think is what you call it. He's kind of infamous, Billy and Noel. You can introduce yourselves, guys.
Yeah, so I'm Billy, or now I go by Guillermo Escobar Vasquez, and essentially, I'm a Hispanista. I believe that Hispanic people, the Spanish-speaking world in general, needs to be united under an empire, and that if we're going to constantly stay divided, then there's going to be other imperial powers that are ultimately just going to make us our bitch at the end of the day. So my message is simple: unite or die with the Hispanic world.
Today, again, we also have Pacifist, who is on episode 1 here again.
Hey guys. Glad to be back on. For those of you that watched me in episode 1, I think you already are familiar with me, but I'll give a quick introduction. I'm a content creator on BitChute. I identify as nothing more than a historical revisionist. I'm not political like the guy before me who spoke, so I do identify as apolitical. I think that's about it.
Hey guys, I can actually say what's up. This is Noel, OG del Rancho. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an Hispanista. I've actually never taken on that label formally because there's several variants of it, and some people might have a bad taste in their mouth because they assume that by taking that position, you're kind of like, I'm a Spaniard LARPer, or like you wish to be, which isn't necessarily my position.
Yes, exactly, Martinez.
But I would adhere to kind of what Guillermo said about, having a united front, a united identity. If we look at history, it gives us the best evidence to how things function when we did have a united front or united imperium. And clearly the last 200 years as these independent republicans haven't necessarily served our best interests outside of the certain elites within our capital cities. So yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, sweet. And over here we have Giovanni from the Futurism Forever podcast.
Hey, what's up, guys? Subscribe to Futurism Forever. Molti nemici, molto onore. Bang, bang.
Oh, sweet. Well, where's that from, actually?
Molti nemici, molto onore. It's like a fascist slogan. It means many enemies, much honor.
Okay, sweet. So we have a lot of people on today, but the main subject of this is supposed to be the Anglo question. I don't know who wants to start, but what is the problem with the Anglos?
Can you please start out? I think you're really good with this.
Yeah, I can. I look at it from really a theological perspective. I think the problems with England started off during the Reformation. And it must be understood that Henry VIII wasn't just motivated by his divorce. Like all things, there's always multiple factors going on for an event to happen. His nobles obviously saw a lot of gold and land that they could take by essentially nationalizing the monasteries and the churches, which, over 1,000 years in England had accumulated a lot of wealth. But also a big dynamic that never really gets touched on is the fact that he didn't want to be like the junior partner to the Spanish Empire, which at this point was essentially very well formed, both on the continent in Europe and in the Americas. You have to remember that the wife he was looking to divorce was actually a aunt or cousin of Philip II, who was the Spanish emperor at the time. And pretty much like what could have happened is that England would have been absorbed by Spain down the line. And that was really a big factor in wanting to break away from the Catholic Church, because at the time, if you broke away from the Catholic Church, you simultaneously broke away from the Spanish Empire. It was almost like they were one and the same. But sadly, with that event in history, the English theology began to change. And this can get a little very high IQ for certain people, but there's a concept in the church called the hypostatic union of Christ, meaning that Christ is fully God and fully man. And you can't divide his two natures. It kind of works in what the church would call a mystery. So when they broke away from that, essentially what happened to the Church of England is that it started to become, Judaized, for lack of a better term. And this concept of a hypostatic union began to get lost. And if you talk to Protestants and you ask them if Jesus is God, most of them will answer and say, yes, Jesus is God. But when you ask them, well, then is Mary the mother of God? They kind of short circuit and they don't have an answer for you. And it's because they have what we would call a semi-Nestorian outlook. They confuse this hypostatic union of Christ. And when you confuse the hypostatic union of Christ, you essentially set yourself up to just fall into endless dialectical tensions. Because Christ being both fully God and fully man heals all dialectical tensions. So you don't fall into these kind of, these Hegelian traps, per se. From Henry came Elizabeth the First, who was an alchemist. It was rumored that she was also a hermaphrodite, and there's been evidence when they dug up her body, and it seems like some of her skeletal structure is a little off. She was an alchemist, and that's very crucial to understand. During Elizabeth's reign is when we had the rise or the foundation of Virginia Colony. And it's no coincidence that it was called Virginia Colony and named during a time of an alchemist queen who did not believe in the church, who did not believe in Christ or the Virgin Mary, most importantly. So naming the colony Virginia and kind of positioning Elizabeth to be the Virgin Queen in many ways was an inversion or a mocking of the Virgin Mary. And that has to be understood if you want to understand America, because that's the foundation of America. Just one real quick
for a second.
I wanted to interject.
Real quick. After Elizabeth comes Oliver Cromwell. And after the Glorious Revolution, where they basically kill the last Catholic king of England. And what does Cromwell do? Well, he invites all the bankers that were kicked out of Spain in 1492 during the Reconquista, the same year that the Spanish discovered the Americas. So these three people have to be really understood if you want to understand Anglo historical development, because from this sequence, you get the rise of essentially everything that we deal with and maybe want to reject today. And that's it.
So I wanted to say something real quick. So one thing that you mentioned is that Protestants seem to short circuit whenever you mention that Mary is the mother of God, but outside of a few like smaller separate Protestant groups, pretty much all of the major denominations recognize that Mary is the mother of God and don't have a problem acknowledging it. They just disagree with a lot of the, I would say, what would most Protestants say is the Mary worship, like the praying to Mary and all that.
Which Protestant denomination specifically are you thinking of when you're describing what you
Presbyterianism, Baptist, like I'm talking about ones that accept Mary as the mother of God?
The Baptists will not accept the title Mother Mary of God.
No. They recognize that Mary is the mother of God.
But they wouldn't call her the mother of God. And that's what I mean. I'm not saying that they'll outright reject it, but it kind of like, it puts them in
Are you talking about, okay, but you're talking about like a Catholic, like specific title, Mary, Mother of God, rather than
Orthodox do that too.
Just if you ask straight up, is Jesus, ask any Protestant, go outside, evangelical, ask him, is Jesus God? 9 out of 10 times, they're going to say yes. And if you follow up that question with, well, is Mary the mother of God? You're not going to get that immediate yes. You're not going to get that immediate answer. You're going to get like, and that's where that semi-Nestorianism kicks in. And it's crucial to understand how the Anglo Empire developed in terms of dealing with the other, and then understanding how the Spanish Empire in terms of dealing with it. It's not the only thing that comes into play with the very different models these two civilizations took. But it is influential, because what you're understanding about Christ when he's both God and man, it also floods into the Trinity. And then it kind of comes down to and this might sound cheesy or liberal to some people or whatever, but it's the recognition that we're all made in the image of God. And yeah, you could be this, savage retard who's still stuck in the Stone Age, but you're still made in the image of God. So there's a basic level of dignity inside you. And this was actually a centerpiece of the development of the Spanish Empire under Charles V, where he actually stopped the conquering. They actually stopped the conquering. They pulled back on the wars. They pulled back, and they had a huge Congress or whatever to look at what they were doing and say, is this in line with traditional apostolic theology? Is what we're doing correct? Are we going about it the right way? At the same time, it was involved to say, are the Indians human? Like, they actually had a debate about this. Like, this is kind of the beginning of human rights in a sense. Are these people human? And therefore, do we have to treat them a certain way? Because up until then, the people who the Spanish were fighting were basically Muslim. And since they were infidels, you could enslave them, right? Because they refused to accept what they considered the proper theology. They're heretics. So then you had, a green light to go ahead and enslave them, just like they enslaved us Christians, right? But the Spanish paused their imperial efforts, their conquering efforts, to analyze themselves. They brought on all these very learned, scholars who were mostly, obviously, priests and monks and stuff like that. And at the same time, to say, are these people who we just encountered in the New World human? And therefore, do we need to treat them a certain way? Can we treat them the same way that we treat the Muslims? Or is there some other pattern that we need to deal with? All this stuff is informed by that basic theology of the hypostatic union. Yeah, and that's it.
Okay, yeah. So I was going to say an interesting thing about America. I've actually shown Billy this before, but in the original colonies, they actually wanted to make Hebrew the official language of the United States when it was in the colonies. And that's partly because the Puritans and also a lot of the original people in the colonies who were the larger landowners were by and large Jewish, or they were like Anglo Masons. And these were the
as well.
Yep. Pacifist is a bit more like woke on the Mason stuff, so he can probably talk about that if he wants to.
No, I mean, I'll just add to what.
Okay.
What do I call you again?
Just call him Noel.
Sorry.
You can call me
Noel.
Rancho. You can call me Rancho.
Okay, I'll just add to what Rancho was saying. He hit the nail on the head with what he said there, and I guess Freemasonry just takes that a step further and denies the divinity of Christ altogether. Within the majority strain of Freemasonry, they actually deny divine revelation. They also deny the divinity of Christ. They view Jesus Christ as a great moral philosopher. And it just divulges further and further into natural philosophy, which, of course, is the foundation of humanism, specifically secular humanism, which is, of course, I would argue, the new religion of the liberal West. That's all I would add to that.
I do know, like, with Father Raphael Johnson, he was talking about how when it comes to like Protestants and Masons, a lot of it's connected to like nominalism, and that has its roots with like Gnosticism, which is part of the reason, say, like Neo-Platonism is condemned by the Catholic Church, for example. Would you say there's a large role of Gnosticism within like the founding of America or like the Anglo world order?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah.
What is nominalism?
I would agree. And yeah, there is roots in nominalism, and coincidence. Nominalism comes out of England through forget this guy's name. It wasn't Duns Scotus, but he contributed to it. Anselm of Canterbury is the guy who really kind of cinched it down. Okay. But I mean, the church has always been battling Gnostic or Nestorian currents within. Like, if you know church history, you know about the Cathars. I mean, you know about the Nestorians, you know about the Arians. So these things tend to kind of creep back in. And I think what we saw happen specifically through what happened in England, the English Reformation, is that it crept back in. And I would agree that the modern paradigm, liberalism as we know it, it wouldn't exist without that.
Could you give like a very brief explanation of what nominalism is? Because there's probably some grugs watching this, by the way.
Yeah, I'll do my best. From what I understand,
Okay.
I'm not that smart. I may sound very smart, but I'm not that smart. Nominalism is like reducing things to like a basic bitch level, and like you miss like the more complicated, deeper truth that perhaps can't be reduced into words fully. Like you miss the message, you know? That's my best swing at it. I don't know if someone has a better explanation of what it is.
Is it kind of like reductionism?
In a sense, yeah, you could group it into that. But I think relating it into like, again, because it's all in the context of like pre-Enlightenment church, is that you're kind of like you get lost in the weeds, you get lost in the superficiality of a concept, but it's kind of like it's recognizing the limits of language, right? It's kind of like a Japanese koan. Are you familiar with a Japanese koan? Like the riddles, like I can't tell you exactly. The church has certain like a mystical element to it, and you can't reduce everything to just like concepts and use language as a tool. Like there's a deeper understanding that you will get by like internalizing what you heard in a kind of mystical way, and so nominalism wipes that all away.
Is it kind of like the mystery of the Trinity? It's like, oh well, you can never really understand the Trinity. It's kind of like that. Like there's a hidden knowledge that you can never quite understand, and nominalism just disregards that aspect.
In a sense, but you know how I would frame it as well. You could look at nominalism as the dad of empiricism.
Okay, that makes sense.
That may make more sense for people.
I think the way I would simplify it is by saying that it is a reductionism of metaphysics. Essentially, it is a philosophical view that denies the existence of universals and abstract objects. So I think it's like more like the philosophic foundation of current natural philosophy.
Yeah, they don't focus on forms; they focus on energy.
Correct. Yeah.
So what you were talking about with like the Catholic element being undermined in England, I do actually have an essay I've written on this that was done in like a very terrible video before called like Language, Power, and Class Analysis. All of this actually transitions over with Cromwell into the 1688 powers of Parliament, I believe, which is actually the start of Whig liberalism. And this is like the direct link to people like, say, Locke or what's the other guy's name who was influential to Locke? Trying to find him really quick. Burke. Burke himself actually supported the American Revolution on the grounds that they were fellow Englishmen, which around this time the crown was actually trying to align itself again with the Catholics, but it didn't really work because it created an ascendant bourgeoisie class and also a strong Mason class, Jewish financial class. Then you also had strong political Protestants, which were the liberals, the Whig liberals. And this connected over to the main founding of the American state. Because of that, how would you say it's manifested into America with like what we currently have?
Well, again, understanding that, that essay, I would actually really like to read it, but Cromwell didn't just pop up on the historical stage, right? Like there was a sequence of things that led to Cromwell. And, if for those who may have a more of an understanding of like the apostolic church history or kind of the concepts and how it worked, is that that's kind of what heresy does. It leads to like continuous line of decay. And so from that point in history where you outline, under Cromwell, there's a sequence of just kind of going down the slippery slope and ending where you are today. Like, I think if you do understand this part of history of English history, you can't disconnect it from the ultimate decay of the United States. I think it's rooted into the DNA of it. Again, with the concept, with understanding that Virginia colony was named in a way to kind of mock this old order. So you can't disconnect the thing. I think there's a straight line that runs all these.
This actually has parallels with what happened in France, because during the French religion wars, it created like a dangerous situation in the French state, and it resulted in the assassination of Henry. I can't read Roman numerals. It's like a capital I and a V, but it basically culminated in his assassination.
That's the fourth.
Yeah, it resulted in his assassination over the religious wars, and that's when we had Louis come to the throne.
If I may interject here for a moment, what Rancho said actually is very good. I would actually trace it back all the way to the 1200s with the Magna Carta Libertatum, which is often touted as the first ever true constitution.
That's what they taught my class in social studies when I was in high school.
Right, and they teach you that it's a good thing, and it's the foundation and bedrock of modern republics and the democracy we all love. But yes, I would say that it's no shock or surprise that this popped up in Britain, and this was under the king. I think King John ruled at the time, and basically it was a set of nobles, 25 noble aristocrats who were sick and tired of the war that was being waged between John and Philip. I think Philip was the king of France at the time.
Are you talking about the 30 Years' War?
This was in 1215. So,
my bad. Didn't hear that.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, they used that as an excuse to push Magna Carta. And of course, John refused in the beginning. That's what led to the Baron Wars. There were 2 Baron Wars over this. So now poor old King John is fighting a war against Philip in France, and at the same time dealing with a civil war being waged against him by these nobles. Eventually, he is forced to agree to their demands, and that's how Magna Carta is passed. And I would argue that it was around that time that we see really the domino effect into what Rancho here was talking about before me.
Mm-hmm. So, so like when it comes to all this to like the American state, we can actually see with a lot of the founders to themselves, a lot of them were Masons. A lot of them were also involved in the French Revolution, besides the American Revolution, and they still had connections with England at the same time. Even though there was a little bit of a war that went on, it wasn't a real war. Many Englishmen actually supported the American Revolution, which is surprising. A lot of people don't know that. Burke is the most famous case. He gave his speech in the Parliament in support. The king was kind of butthurt about it, but most of English society supported the American Revolution.
Right.
And I do think that, Facifist, do you know more about, like, when it comes down to the founding of America? From what I know of, you have an entire video that talks about the Masonic influence of, like, the founding of America. I also know when it comes down to the American civilization as itself, if you read the original Naturalization Act and what it defines as white, for example, even Jews are considered white in that, and it even has a type of, it has a Nordicist element to like the racial theory. It is actually anti-German, but it is also anti-Mediterranean. It's anti-everybody that is not a Jew and not an Anglo. And
that is correct. Yes,
so
that is how
would you? They weren't counted as white men of good character in 1790. That had to be added on later.
Yeah. So, could you tell us a bit about the American founding and how interconnected with all this stuff it is? Because I just gave like a very brief overview. Some people are probably listening to this and like, what the fuck is this guy talking about?
Well, for starters, I would like to shill my documentary on the topic, which is what is it's a pretty long title for a name. Let me pull it up real quick. It's called The American Revolution. And then I gotta get the rest of it, the subtitle.
Now, where can this be found? BitChute, YouTube? Where do you host this?
This is on YouTube. It's called The American Revolution, a conspiracy to further the great work of Freemasonry. And it's about an hour and 18 minutes long. I'm going to put it in the chat. Give me 1 second. Where is it? Oh, I'm missing the chat. What's the name of this chat again?
Fascio podcast.
Sorry about that, guys. All right, here it is. There it is. Ignore the timestamp. That was an accident. That's not supposed to be there. But anyway, yeah. So getting into a little bit of the story as to how interconnected all these secret elements that were responsible for the American Revolution actually are. For starters, Benjamin Franklin was a huge key figure in the American Revolution as well as the French Revolution. Benjamin Franklin was also a fellow member of the Hellfire Club, which of course meant he was very close to a man by the name of, what's his name again? God, Francis Dashwood. That's his name, yeah, Francis Dashwood. And Francis Dashwood was a close advisor of His Majesty King George III. King George III, of course, was suffering from a debilitating disease that kept him out of commission from actually properly ruling the empire, which meant that a lot of his advisors and even Parliament itself was making a lot of the decisions regarding the affairs of the empire at the time. This was, of course, a perfect opportunity for the 600 plus Freemasons to further their agenda, again, keeping the king in the dark about what they were planning. Francis Dashwood, of course, was very intimate with Benjamin Franklin and basically orchestrated the entire thing. They even wrote letters to each other. And Francis Dashwood's letters, he talks about a man by the name of Moses. It's a code name. And he's writing to this person named Moses. Well, who is this Moses? Turns out it's Benjamin Franklin. That's what I've come to conclude, as have many others. Benjamin Franklin is the Moses-type figure that leads the Anglo-Saxons into the new Israel, which, of course, is America. So Benjamin Franklin, of course, uses I guess you could say, finances. Of course, the American Revolution was financed by a Jew named Chaim Solomon, but it's not just the finances. It's also the organization and the orchestration. It was all done with the aid and help of Freemasons in Parliament. So they were working together with the Masonic lodges that were in America that were set up shortly before the Revolution.
There's actually a book called Freemasonry and Judaism, The Secret Powers Behind Revolution by Leon D. Panakins, I think is how you say it.
Oh, my bad.
That's a good book.
It talks about that.
Right, exactly. That's a good book. And just to show you guys just how interconnected the American Revolution was to the French Revolution, Benjamin Franklin was lodge master in Paris at a lodge called the Lodge of Nine Sisters. And he actually initiated Voltaire into Freemasonry. And the Lodge of Nine Sisters in Paris it's located exactly where the French Revolution broke out, just a little bit afterwards. So it's rather ironic that the Anglo-Saxon Masons, who were responsible for the American Revolution, they got the aid of the King of France, but then they repaid the King of France by inciting another revolution in France, which of course we know resulted in the decapitation of the king and the queen's heads.
I'm pretty sure there was a American who is a Mason who actually went over to the French Revolution and actually fought with the French after winning the American one.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised if there were multiple ones that did that.
There were multiple, but the one you're referring to was titled The Hero of Two Worlds, and that was Lafayette.
Wasn't Jefferson almost doing that too, if I'm not mistaken?
I believe Thomas Paine, who was like the ideologue. And I think the other element that the Masons played in the colonies was that they served as a propaganda tool to kind of propagandize the population as much as they can, even though I think a big chunk of the population didn't want to break away from England. Thomas Paine, I believe, also did that. I think he went to France and kind of did the same thing he was doing here.
Thomas Paine was a humanist, wasn't he?
Thomas Paine was a humanist. He was a deist. He was highly critical of Christianity. He mocked it openly in his writings. It was so bad.
He wrote a book called Common Sense and the Rights of Man.
Popular with people like Jordan Peterson.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, they promoted it in high school. In high school, they tested you about that sort of stuff all the time. And the general consensus from what the teachers would tell, at least me, was common sense was something that was extremely influential, extremely important among the intellectuals that founded America.
I actually have a copy.
There's even American cadences in the military where they would say, use your common sense. It's kind of ingrained in the military too.
Yeah, well, even the boomers say it today. A lot of people just say, you know, common sense, common sense, common sense. But common sense in and of itself is part of an ideology.
If you guys want, there's a 3-hour documentary by a man named Jose Pinto called "The Hidden Faith of the Founding Fathers." That's a very good documentary to watch. And that
hold on, what's Jose's European percentage? I need to know in order to consider watching this. Sorry.
Jose Pinto?
Does he make the threshold?
I don't know much about the guy. I just watched the documentary and found the information to be accurate.
He better not be an Indio, because I'll be mad.
No,
Brandon won't be happy.
The Indios come from the Siberian Proto-European, so they're also white by extent. They're just red whites.
Oh, that's true. It's woke. My bad.
My God.
Well, he's in the documentary, so if you see his face, like you can literally see his face in the documentary.
Gotcha.
That was epic.
I think another thing to note here is how I think in the large scheme of things, as far as like England, the American War, the Revolutionary War was pretty insignificant. Like even the biggest battles, like didn't pass 10,000 men, I believe. Like if you look into the actual battles,
it wasn't a real conflict. It was just
it
was like stationed in the colonies. Really,
it was theater. It was theater because, like I said, they had massive control over the entire thing. It wasn't until a lot later that
January 1812 is when they actually had like a real war.
Right. Exactly. And that's when they pissed their pants and cowered.
That's when America really overtook Britain. Really, like America got its ass kicked pretty bad at first, but then after that, then America
they were on
the way to surpassing Britain, especially after the Civil War. Like we surpassed them completely.
That conflict, by the way, they were saved by a storm. There was this freak storm that rolled through D.C. and apparently drove the British away. But they did manage to burn the White House, so that was a feat.
Wasn't that the Canadians that did that?
I mean, yeah, under the British.
That was the British. That was a commander by the name of Cockburn. Cockburn was responsible for
Cockburn.
It was named Admiral.
What a name.
I think it's important to note that, you know, what you guys just laid out, because I think that the English cared a lot more about a territory like India, a colony like India, than and you know, for me, looking back now, like I can't really say that America and England are a separate place. Like, yeah, they have two different flags, but to me, it seems like they're still part of the same holding company. You know, aside from the spat of 1812, these countries pretty much have had the same agenda and have fought in every war on each other's side. I don't see that divorce or that independence, say, in the way that you could see from Mexico and Spain, you know, to give you a closer contrast.
Well, during the war between the states, like Britain supported the Confederacy in that conflict.
Well, the Confederacy, like even if we compare it to the North, a lot of the large like landowners in the Deep South were like actually Jews or like high-ranking like Anglo aristocrats that related to England. In the North itself, you also had strong Mason, Jewish, and you also had a class distinction. So in the North, you had more Anglos, and they tended to consider like the Southerners to be basically like white trash and like an inferior caste, basically.
Yeah, and I did a whole book review, actually. I recommend everyone listening to this to go on my YouTube channel, check out White Trash. I did this with Marcus Cicero, and yeah, I think if you really want to understand how class relations operated for real in America, and you don't want to just get it from memes that you hear on like, you know, podcasts where people don't know what they're talking about, I definitely recommend reading this sorts of stuff and checking out reviews like, you know, like this sort of podcast as well, by the way.
Yeah, I'm trying to talk with like anybody has anything interesting to say in the community, so I'm probably gonna have a lot of people contradict each other at some point. But yeah.
Well, I mean, if the Confederacy had succeeded and they had their own separate country, that would have weakened the overall influence of the Union as well, which means they probably wouldn't be powers on par to compete with Britain.
Right, well, and that's why actually elements, I believe, of Latin American society that low-key wanted the Confederacy to win as well, because, the more you could divide up America, the better, Latin America would ultimately be as a result, if I'm not mistaken.
Here's another interesting thing. After the end of the war between the states, a lot of people from the Confederacy actually immigrated down to Mexico and Argentina.
And Brazil.
And Brazil.
All right.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter actually visited the descendants of the Confederacy, I believe, when he got elected, and took some pictures with them. It's actually pretty interesting because get these guys that do these Confederate festivals, and a lot of them are just mulattoes now, but it's not even really become this explicit Anglo racial thing anymore. It's really
right.
Interesting.
They celebrate Southern culture. They have their own little Confederate festivals.
Yep.
It's actually pretty cool. Isn't there a place like that in that's like a little German community? They're mostly intermixed now.
I mean, there's a lot of those in South Brazil where, they'll speak to you in German first if you walk up and say hi, even if you don't look phenotypically German. Yeah.
Yeah, that happens all over Latin America. There's places that speak old Venetian, not even modern Italian. And even in a little country like Nicaragua, there's German towns where people have learned German who were not part of that original kind of immigrant community, but they still speak the language after all these generations.
All right, so I'm gonna pull it back now and go back over to America. So I talked about briefly on how Anglos understood what they considered quote unquote white, which was connected to Nordicist theory. So doesn't that basically mean the whole concept is say people who push say white nationalism are actually pushing the meme? They're just revamping the racial theory that the Anglos were pushing originally?
Yes, and before we go on, I just want to interject and say the people that ascribe Nordicism onto German racial theory, especially around the Third Reich, they're projecting English ideas onto Germany, and that's a travesty, to be honest, because it's undermining actual German culture.
Oh yeah. So what do you guys think? Because I know Billy has talked about it a bit. I don't know what Rancho thinks, but what would you guys say about that?
Yeah, well, the way that I would describe it is that there is a kind of a new nation, if you will, being born or has already started to be born within the United States. The classic Amerimut, who's a quarter Italian, a quarter Scotch Irish, and everything else. And
I'm pure Anglo. I'm excluded.
Yeah. And so it's in the context of the U.S., what label does that person put on them? And I think the trap that they're falling into is that they put the label white, and I feel like white is an Anglo copyright. It's it's their copyright, they own it. And so then it kind of implies a certain ranking where the English are peak white, Anglos are peak white, and maybe, some of the Nordicists or whatever. And then there's peripheral whites. And then there's whites when it's convenient to us. And then they're not white when we don't want them to be.
Well, I can think historically for that is how you had anti-Irish sentiment. You even had anti-German sentiment throughout the United States. Even with the KKK, for example, which is historically WASP supremacist.
Yes.
Besides lynching blacks, the people they lynched the most historically and killed through lynchings were actually Italian immigrants.
Yeah, they burned down Greek churches as well.
Wait, hold on.
The biggest lynching in U.S. history was against Italians, not blacks.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of people don't know that.
And I also want to add, they actually lynched more Germans than Negroes. That's another fact. It's true.
I've heard things like that. That.
Do you know which wave of the KKK it was?
Probably the one that's connected most to B'nai B'rith.
We'll say probably the second one, if I had to guess. The first one, I think, was mostly guerrilla warfare during Reconstruction, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct, that's right. Yeah, and then the second one was when they were actually starting to kind of go out of control, because the first one was originally run by General Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest.
That's right.
Funded by Judah Benjamin as well.
Yeah.
And Bedford Forrest rescinded and like refuted what he started.
Well, right, yeah,
was
because
sincere or
he ended up coming to terms. He never really considered his organization explicitly racist, right? And even when he was in interviews with journalists, he rebuffed that claim, because later on, when he shut down the organization because it was illegalized by the union, he ended up like basically becoming a figure for racial equality in the U.S.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like he was kind of trying to get to a harmony somehow.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And earlier when you were talking about white, I don't know if you've heard of E. Michael Jones' position on it, but I do like the way that he has explained it. Yeah. Like where he says that, well, white is, a definition when it is really just like a reactionary definition. Like, okay, you have black identity. Right. There's black people now, and you look white, so there's black people and there's white people now. Well, instead of like Africans and Europeans.
Yeah, there's actually a thing from Iron March that we reviewed on the Futurist Forever podcast, and that was of Giovanni, called like American Futurism. And like I don't agree with the manifesto, but it gives a good explanation as to why you have white nationalism and black nationalism. And in the case of America, because it was founded on these liberal values, the way like Anglo specifically, when they used like things like white nationalism, they didn't consider other groups white, but when they interacted with other minority groups like blacks or like brown Hispanics, for example, or Native
the white Hispanics. Wait, hold on. Even the white Hispanics, they called like Moors. I mean, I have like documents to prove that too.
I know. Even when they interact with Chinese, they would appeal to people who had light skin to try and unify them so they could attack brown people instead of going after people like them who were pushing these ideas. And that's how you had basically the creation of white nationalism, because like white nationalists felt like they had to it was more of a reactionary forming, like the actual ideology itself, because it came out of a necessity, out of the fact that Americans didn't have a culture because they were intermixing, and two, it was something that the Anglos were pushing, that it was expanded out to create class relations in the first place, which sounds very Marxist on face value, but it's actually what they did historically. And
well, Jones was right. I mean, Jones was correct, I think, when he said that whiteness was a way in which the Anglo elites essentially pushed for new ethnic minorities from Europe to abandon their ethnic roots and to essentially take on this new this new identity that was it's always fluid. It's always been changing. There's been constant Supreme Court cases deciding who's white and who isn't. Black nationalism is just as silly. And black nationalism is silly too. Like I oppose that just as much as I would oppose white nationalism, I would say.
Because black identity is also a false construct. It's basically just a purely American construct.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. So we call those people Afro-Saxons. Because they virtually have the same mentality as your kind of grug white nationalists, where they have this like monolithic view of races, where like all the races of Europe are one race. So a Finn is the same race as an Andalusian, or Ethiopian is the same race as a West African. But go to Africa and tell Africans that, and they'll wake up. But it's just kind of like, I feel like it's a huge coping mechanism when you become deracinated and you lose your ethnic identity and roots. And so you need to grab onto something. And so then it's like, oh, well, the pyramids are on the continent of Africa. I come from Africa. Therefore, we made the pyramids.
We was Israelites.
Well, it is because America itself is a nega culture that defines itself by materialism.
That's
primarily.
Correct.
And so it's only natural that you have these groups in America, like people who consider themselves black and white, defining themselves in a new way and in a materialistic way.
Well, in a reductionist way, because they reduce
everything to skin color.
To the color of the leather of your skin. There's no spirit, there's no soul, there's no tradition, there's no, again, it's like you see the nominalism at play there. Like they reduce man to the color of his skin.
Yes, it makes intelligent people, like for example, Francis Parker Yockey, as intelligent as he was very clownish in how he would write about how the ancient Incan people were like Aryan Nordic people, and that's just like that's the sort of like intellectual like path that it will send people racialists down in America, and that's by design, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, like I recommend people to like read A. James Gregor's like essay on race and National Socialism, actually, because the type of stuff that he's bringing up right there with like Yaki is because of like people like Gunther who like influenced Nordicism,
exactly.
which has influence of people like Madison Grant, and like there is like a slight overlap with the German theory, but it is mostly rejected. But Madison Grant's ideas became heavily ingrained in the American elite, which is why they came up with the eugenicist movement, Planned Parenthood, to do the conservative meme where they just wanted to sterilize all the blacks, for example, or like
yeah, and Margaret Sanger was someone that was important in this, and her husband was Jewish, by the way, and there was no question on whether her Jewish husband was considered to be white or not back then.
I do want to point out, for like modern context, that like the elite in the United States actually still think this way. It's just they have PR. The PR is the woke culture. But I guarantee, like, if you get somebody like Biden and what they actually think, if you look at what he was saying back in the day, he was talking about segregation and using racial slurs.
Yeah.
He probably still does that now. He just has better PR.
Totally. You know, the white liberals are just ultimate hypocrites. You know, they'll say like, oh, I'm not a racist. And, you know, the irony is that the redneck who might call you, you know, the N-word or whatever else, you know, at the end of the day, like, you can actually build rapport and relate with him. And like, he'll probably invite you to have a beer on his porch at the very least. Right. Like, it's the liberal who acts like, oh yeah, you know, I love little brown people or whatever.
Oh yeah, Malcolm X talks about why.
Wait, is this the enlightened liberals are the real racists?
Essentially, because they'll never invite you over to their house. You know what I'm saying? Unless you're a Guatemalan servant, you know, hired to clean it. And you better know that they're probably going to gyp you on payment. You know,
the only people they let into these communities are like token minorities that are married to Jewish people usually.
Yeah, and I want to also say as well, and this is going to cause a little bit of a shitstorm when this is released, but I don't really care. This is also how the elites of modern white nationalism, for the most part, still operate and believe privately in their own circles to this day. It's still heavily influenced by all of this.
A lot of these people do have very shallow views on what identity is. And the way I've concluded, I mean, I've come up to about 5 or 6 metaphysical axioms to derive identity out of. And this isn't just ethnic or national, but even familial. So on the level of like 5 people that are related by blood, I would boil it down to logos, pathos, ethos, mythos, and economia. Those are the 5 I would definitely say are important when it comes to identity.
Yeah, the temporal thing is like one aspect, and it's not even like an absolute aspect. Like,
sure,
right.
People can be fathered into a doctrine. It's
correct.
It just
so Genos, I do agree. Genos is one aspect, but like they're fixated on Genos and they ignore the other 5.
Well,
yeah,
like they reduce it. You focus on that. You end up with people who push siege and like support terrorists, basically.
Right. I mean, it sounds a lot. This reminds me of like what the American First guys have been saying lately, where they say race is something, but not everything.
Well, it's really convenient.
America First is another problem on its own.
That's really convenient. Their leader is a mestizo, though, right?
Yeah,
well, I mean, I guess I think he's like half Hispanic, half white.
For twin, well, he's.
But I've heard it a lot from. I've heard it a lot from the white. Yeah, the white Groyper generals. I've heard them say that because they want to take the focus off, you know, Whignattery.
Well, it's because like Fuentes' ideology, no matter what he does, even paleoconservatism, which is what he pushes, is still built off liberal ontology. So no matter what he does, he's still going to be an incoherent retard. And the other thing is the dude belongs in prison because he's broken so many fucking federal laws with that stupid fucking capital C shit.
But it doesn't take away from the truthfulness of the statement and how it relates to what we're talking about right now.
God, I really hate Fuentes.
I wanted to add one thing, you guys, when we're talking about the black-white thing, and earlier we touched on Masonry, and again, I don't see a disconnect from that, right? Like the black and white squares in a Masonic temple, reducing things to this kind of false duality. We touched on how you can fall into dialectical traps. I don't see that as a coincidence, and the Hispanic experience has been where we come to this place and it's like we have to be black or white. and it's like we're not either. And
there's a meme on that. Be a black dude or a white supremacist, and it shows like two paths.
Well, yes, because they're becoming Americanized, and so they get deracinated, so they adopt these identities.
Well, that's a conversation we had with Parrot, like on that. Like he actually, like I don't hate Parrot. I actually like him as a person, but like he wants white Hispanics to become like Americanized, which personally, like I don't support that because they're
he's
like,
trying to recruit us. We know that.
I do not.
We've tried
to
talk to Parrot about this.
I do not want Hispanics.
Well, Parrot will take whatever bodies he can, though, because the white nationalist movement is falling apart, and they need new blood. Like, it's not a coincidence that mestizos like Fuentes and like Eric Stryker are like some of these leaders in the white nationalist movement, because that's pretty much what's happened. The original stock of America has degenerated to such a degree that now brown people like Tulsi Gabbard as well are having to do all the jobs that white people don't want to do.
Yeah, he's just trying to bulk his numbers to save his own skin, and he'll discard us later. Like,
have some second class whites who can unclog the toilet when it gets stuck, and that's what we denounce. We call those Hispanics that kind of want to be white. We call them pygmies, and we call the Hispanics that carry water for the blacks. We call them Latinxers. And I have like beef with both ends of that spectrum. And you're right. It's kind of coming into America. You become deracinating, you fall into these traps. But I think the dynamic that's starting to show itself here north of the Rio Grande, to say, is that that third position of identity is coalescing, and it's becoming obvious to Hispanics of the millennial and Zoomer generation, where they no longer necessarily feel like they have to fit into this black-white Masonic squares dialectic.
The false dichotomy.
So I know, like in America, so you could say like when it came to like Protestant influence on culture, you still have like a semblance of like a religious aspect to America. I would argue started going a bit more.
Yeah, the Great Awakenings were very important. Yeah, culturally.
Yeah, I would argue it went a bit more downhill, probably starting in the 1920s, which is when it started reaching like a crisis. And that's because you had the influx of what became modern consumerism, which is fully actualized in the thinker Edward Bernays, which is where we end up with modern mass society. Century to Self is like it's a pretty good documentary you guys could check out, or Braving Ruins, how individualism ate itself. It's a pretty good explanation and how marketing politics, focus group politics, and working with the corporate sector became like the main factor of the American economy, which was already heavily ingrained with like high-ranking Anglos, Masons, and also Jews themselves too. And part of what Bernays wanted was like a global market where you didn't really have an aspect of culture or identity for people or religiosity. Everything was commodified. Everything was fetishized with material consumption. And
I was going to say real quick, Thomas Jefferson, you can actually see some of this in some of his writings as well, where most people don't know this. He was actually very open to the idea of inviting Islamic immigrants to the United States and like let them have their little section too. Mm-hmm. Like these ideas early on of America being a Masonic shopping mall, these were all very much present and aware, from the very beginning, and then it became much more powerful as time went on.
Yeah, it was fully actualized though. Like with Bernays, he was a relative of Freud too, so there was a heavy focus,
of course,
on pushing like sexualization within consumption, especially when it came to like marketing itself too. He wanted to do this because he considered real identities, religiosity, to be basically a threat to the type of society that he wanted. He thought people were completely irrational, insane. They were a lower and inferior class that had to be controlled through consumerism, and that's what he wanted to do. He was even closely associated with like what became the CIA by working in propaganda campaigns to get them to overthrow different governments during the Cold War.
Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, did you guys know that Alexander Hamilton was Jewish, that his mother was a Jew?
I believe it was
no idea. I mean,
Fascination actually did a deep dive on that. Regardless,
wasn't he part black as well?
I don't know about that, but I can.
He's from the West Indies.
Yeah, they believe that he had an ancestor about 2 generations back that was black.
To me, I really don't care about going back and trying to decide who's a Jew, who isn't, yada, yada, yada. Like, I actually dislike how people do that because it, like, assigns Jews, like, this demigod status of just, like, they were everywhere, they were everyone. And it's just, like, anti-Semitism in a lot of ways, especially the way done by the mainstream Grug white nationalist podcast, just becomes a really weird form of philo-Semitism that constantly praises them as being like these totally omnipresent people that are just running every single little thing behind the scenes. And I don't think they're like that.
I think that's a misrepresentation, but okay.
To be fair, the only time I point that out mainly is when it's in the context of Anglo-Saxons who surround them, because they are always allowed to keep their Jewish identity, whereas in continental
That's my
Europe,
point. They're allowed by these other elites to do this stuff.
right?
Well,
In continental Europe, they're expected to assimilate or be treated according to the Catholic Church's prescription, which is Secur Judaeus non.
Well, even
It's important to contrast. Sorry, keep
Anglos
going.
consider themselves Jewish too, because like there's a thing called Anglo-Israelism, which is basically the
that's where Christian identity came from. Yeah,
stuff. Which is also actually white identity and black identity is actually derived out of Jewish identity.
Hebrew Israelites who do the same thing. It's just a cheap imitation again, and they don't even do it as good as actual Jews. That's the really sad part.
Well, the funny thing about the Black Hebrew Israelites is that there's a very much older tradition of British Israelism, where they consider themselves part of one of the lost tribes. One of the lost tribes, or some of the lost tribes.
Yeah,
ended
William
up in England.
Dudley Pelly, leader of the Silver Shirts, considered himself a Anglo-Israelite, and the Anglos in America to be a lost tribe of Israel.
And Mormonism itself goes even more into this and gets even more silly, like even compared to mainstream Protestants.
Because Mormons are heretical.
And yeah, there's a total connection with obviously Zionism and the evangelical churches and all that. This philo-Semitism is again very historical.
Yeah, Marching into Zion does a pretty good outline.
It's important to contrast as well that under New Spain, like Judaism was just straight out outlawed. So there's a lot of people that try muddying the waters on the history of New Spain.
You guys, right?
Yeah, we did. That's what we did. We conquered them, and they mixed with us, and they became Catholic. And yeah, there was a harsh inquisition to make sure that they weren't trying to do like shady stuff behind the scenes, which I think worked better in the end than like trying to do stuff like the Roman camps or massacres on the Eastern Front. I think that ultimately integrating and assimilating them racially into your empire is much smarter.
So Napoleon
was actually a Hispanic person I know.
Thank you for confirming that Napoleon was based. I appreciate that.
But see, the difference between Napoleon and that is that Napoleon didn't have the church. Like there's going back to E. Michael Jones, where he defines Jews as someone who's rejected Christ, right, is a theological identity more than anything. That's something that Napoleon was disconnected from.
But the idea that Napoleon was this horrible antichrist atheist his whole life is literally British Masonic propaganda that Catholics buy into. Napoleon actually died a very faithful Catholic, and towards the end of his career, he was an actual Catholic.
Yeah, and Black Legend propaganda is also a major thing that the British tried to taint our society with as well. And many people, including like members of my own family, they were just taught this, and that's, what they just assumed to be true throughout most of their time on Earth here.
Very few people know that Catholic.
Seems like America is a total train wreck in this sense.
Agreed.
So, like, what would you say is like the modern overlap with like the white nationalist movement actually itself regarding all this? Or like the class relations itself from that one book you were talking about?
So, I mean, the overall thing is that white nationalists are in a very big pickle right now because they're in a war right now, ideologically. Right now, they're fractured into a million pieces. And one of the major things that is fracturing these people is, in a lot of ways, the Hispanic question. Like, we've seen this play out on Telegram. Like, I'm just going to say it with people like Matt Parrott and like people that are more want to be more want to be more ideologically pure. It's like they're coming to this question of, well, we have all these Hispanics here. Many of them have a lot of European blood. Should we, integrate them into our movement so we can build new life, have new life upon that, or do we keep ourselves as pure as possible? And there's a huge war going on between them. And I think ultimately right now, the U.S. government in itself is planning on integrating Hispanics as being the new class of white people. And I don't think there's going to be a white minority by 2040. I think just Hispanics are going to be white eventually. I think Northeast Asians are going to be integrated as white. White has always been a fluid definition, and it's going to constantly change depending on what the elites of America want it to be at the moment.
Even Richard Spencer, when he was talking with JF, talked about how this has become the new electoral strategy for like the Republican Party to dog whistle racism, but to doctor in like Hispanics and have Hispanics lead them.
Yeah, that's what they've been doing. And actually, what's really interesting is Florida is one of these groundwork states where this is happening in the strongest right now, and Texas as well, where a lot of these people, especially like Gusanos, Tejanos, a lot of these people are brown as can be, even browner than me, but they're taking on, like, they're starting to embrace this idea that they're white now. And essentially, this is why, and I think the system is invested in doing so because, for many years, you had people like Jared Taylor claiming, and even TRS claiming that, these Mexican immigrants, these Hispanics, are going to turn all of these states permanently blue. America's going to be a one-party state.
They even considered Zimmerman white too.
Yeah, they did. But my point is like, that's not what's going to happen. The system has a vested interest in keeping this as a two-party system. They want to keep it as even as possible, and they're going to convince they're going to convince Hispanics that they're white in, the Southwest in order to keep the playing field even, so that you have like a 51-49 election result every 4 years. They can't have a one-party state, or it's going to be a disaster.
Zimmerman,
are you saying that if somehow? Oh, sorry.
Just wanted to say real quick. Zimmerman, by the way, that sounds a little too German Hun. Doesn't sound like Anglo-Saxon.
Well, Zimmerman's dad's a German Jew, actually, and his mom's Peruvian.
So, are you saying that if Hispanics in America recognize their identity, that somehow they'll upset the balance of the two-party system?
Well, more than just that, but yes. That in a short answer, yes, because they want us to go into this common trap that Europeans fell into, which is be white or be black.
But if that happens, what then would happen?
Well, then
let's say they realize they're
in the United States that they can't really control, and that other parties across the world, like the Chinese and Russians, are going to take advantage of and are going to probably assist in the future. Because geopolitical opponents of America, like Russia, for example, have a vested interest in supporting any and all ethnic and racial conflicts that could occur in the United
political
States.
Theory time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
Dugan talks about even in geopolitics about supporting any type of separatist movement in the United States, like Hispanic, Black, or even like the white nationalist. As long as it leads to America balkanizing, he pretty much supports it.
Well, what's funny is actually the reason Matt Parrott hates Duganism is because they actually try to get support from Alexander Dugin, and he basically called them a bunch of clowns, and then he wasn't going to support them because he didn't think there was going to be anything that Russia would benefit from supporting TWP. So that's the real news that happened, and that's why Parrott's really ass hurt about Alexander Dugin and the fact that Hispanics in America are starting to warm up to a lot of his basic ideas on embracing a multipolar world, for example.
Well, they were kind of we even talked with Colton. Apparently, besides like some of the stuff in TWP, you had dudes on drugs, like actual drug addicts. You had one guy who did like a cuckold relationship where just one dude let like 3 different members have sex with his wife in front of him. Then you had Heimbach who spent most of the group's funds on prostitutes, got the organization completely in debt, and then managed to cuck Parrott. Like, I like Parrott. I don't know how he hasn't killed Heimbach yet. Just the Fed post right there as a joke, but like, Jesus.
How is he still cool with this dude?
I can't read Parrott's mind.
I think it just shows a degeneration of American culture, and you see it on the black side, you see it on the white side. Like, I grew up in Southern California, in the South Bay, like the Beach Cities area. I grew up in Inglewood as well, which was kind of more of a black area, and so it's like I know blacks and whites very well. And for me, it's funny to see like the average white kind of point out the deficiencies in black community because they're so obvious and like loud, you know, like for example, like a black dude like from the hood will literally pimp his baby mama. Like he will put an ad up on Craigslist and like sell that hoe and get that money, even though like that's his children's mother. But the white dude will take his wife to a swinger party and not even get paid for it. He'll have to pay for the swinger party. So it's like you see this degeneracy and this hypocrisy, but you see how like they're both on the same boat. And for me as a Hispanic, it's just really funny to see how much these people supposedly hate each other, but they're fucking the same. They have the same values.
They act exactly the same, and they have the same lack of culture and the same lack of values. Yeah, absolutely.
And see, this was a major conflict in which Rancho and I actually, with former members of TRS from Beyond the Wall, we did a rebuttal video to Eric Stryker. Essentially, he was answering these super chats on the People's Square that Zero Schizo asked him.
Was it from his conversation with me?
Yeah, it actually was, which is what's funny. And Eric Stryker has like this really weird concept in his head where he thinks being black is a personality trait. And like outside of America, most people don't operate and think like this. Like it's very bizarre.
Only young white British kids do.
Yeah, so, and that's what Eric wants to be.
So I'm not really convinced the Hispanics won't just become their own kind of like materialized identity in the U.S. because you already do see that in places like South Texas and places like Arizona and Nevada. Like you they are.
Yeah, no,
they do
right.
consider themselves. Yeah, okay. Sorry.
The phenomenon you see of what we'll call the brown gringo, right, for lack of a better term. The gringo, again, like if Black Americans or white Americans go anywhere in Latin America, like it doesn't matter if you're black to us, you're still a gringo, right? Like you're an American, you know? And I think that's kind of shocking to black people. But there is this phenomenon of a brown gringo, and there's a Republican version of him and there's a Democrat version of him. But even more than in the US, you actually see this happening in Colombia, and you see it happening in Mexico, and you see it happening in Chile, where this degenerate liberalism is seducing Latin America. Now, the benefit of Latin America is that it's still rooted and steeped into like this pre-Enlightenment traditional worldview.
Well, it's very agrarian and Catholic in a lot of areas.
Yes, the language is gendered. So it's, you know, the roles of male and female and the expectations of them are very clear cut and embedded into the culture. That doesn't mean that that's enough to save you from liberal degeneracy, but it does kind of help hedge it. And now the other dynamic that you have down there is that the Protestant Reformation never occurred. So you went from Catholicism to liberalism. So it was like, it doesn't fit very well because you need like this step in between. So, you know, I think that's part of the reason that kind of explains the dysfunction down there, where it's like you're trying to do something that you didn't prep for.
I would argue as well, real quick, that, you know, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, the violence and poverty that exists in Latin America. But at the same time, you know, there is the fact of the matter that if, you know, you are in a country where there's constant violence, political and on the street, when there's massive poverty, you don't have as much time to really focus on things like gay marriage, like, you know, all these pet bourgeois social issues that, you know, white liberals in places like Seattle and Portland take up because they're just empty people who are bored out of their fucking mind and they have more money than they know what to do with. You know, there is something about poverty that kind of, you know, helps to ground you into the earth. And I would argue, Noel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is a big reason for why, you know, Nicaragua has been able to avoid a lot of the degeneracy that has infected the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, even south of the border of Nicaragua, Costa Rica, right? That now has legalized gay marriage. That's correct. Like gay marriage will never happen in Nicaragua because like the culture, not that there isn't this class of like kids who travel to Miami, you know, because their parents have money and they're on Instagram and they're just kind of buying into that degenerate culture and want it. But like, it's just never going to happen. And neither is abortion. Like there's no abortion, not even in cases of rape where the mother's going to die. Like, and like, there's been cases of like abortionist doctors, like have been found out for having clandestine abortions and they disappear. Like they literally just disappear from the earth.
Oh no, that sucks.
Which kind of hints at like, you know, how the people take care of things. But yeah, I think there is a benefit to poverty because if you can't afford an iPhone, then you can't get on Pornhub. You know what I mean? Like, if you can't get an Android, how are you going to get on Instagram and see how all the little hoes in the West are dressing? There is something to that.
Yes, but in Nicaragua, don't we also have the drug cartels like kind of dominating the local population there?
No, not in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, you have what we call a plaza. A plaza is like, for example, in Mexico, you have different factions fighting for different plazas, right? Like different entryways or routes. That's called a plaza. In Nicaragua, you only have one plaza, and it's owned and managed by the Sandinista party. There's no gangs like in El Salvador or Honduras. There's no MS-18. There's none of that shit. Like
the murder rate is very low in Nicaragua compared to the rest of Latin America.
It's one of the safest countries in the American continents.
I like this. I like what you said about poverty. Not to cut you off real quick, but I like what you said about poverty because that reminded me of this quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, which it goes something along the lines of those who possess much are that much more possessed. Blessed be a little poverty. I just thought of that when you said that.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of wisdom to that. And of course, there's a bunch of scripture that kind of goes along with that. But Nicaragua, to give you a quick, there's no. If you're a guy who's trying to start up routes and maybe have an armed gang, you're going to be a direct competitor to the Sandinista party, and they're way more well armed and willing to take you out. So there's no tolerance for even street gangs. If you're walking around shirtless and you have tattoos, you're going to spend the night in jail if a cop sees you. I'm not saying that there isn't degeneracy. There's degeneracy everywhere, of course. But, there's such thing as a fertile degeneracy, which is you have 3 baby mamas. And there's such thing as an infertile degeneracy, which is what you see in the West. Latin America is going through. It's not just the Hispanics north of the border. It's happening down there. But what you're starting to also have is a reaction against that. And you're starting to have kind of a historical revisionism or people kind of looking back at our history and our ethnogenesis and kind of rejecting the Black legend lies that the Republicans taught us, steeped in their liberal Masonic values. And so you see the rise of this, quote unquote, Hispanista movement, which, to be honest, is very old. I mean, you can point it to the late 1800s or.
Eric Straker insists it's a meme created by people like Saul Alinsky. No, this is as Noel was saying. As Noel was saying, this was made by authors as early as the 1800s. There was
popular with the Falange leader. It was even popular at the Falange with Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, I believe.
And with Franco in practice as well, because Franco, you have to understand this was a man that, modern communists hate Franco, but, he still supported Fidel Castro. I believe he was cordial with Nicaragua and assisted
Castro,
them during the Cold War.
Pinochet, and Franco.
Yeah. He was in a lot of ways. And he also helped Che Guevara as well in terms of he created a conference in Madrid in which Juan Perón and Che Guevara were able to talk about plans in which Juan Perón was actually trying to talk Che out of doing an attempted revolution in Bolivia because he believed it was just not going to pan out, and that he was actually trying to convince Che to focus more on something in Argentina to more solidify and to make sure that Peronism stays put in Argentina. But here's the thing, gringo communists can't understand this sorts of thing. They see Franco as an evil, fascist, but how are these people going to explain that the fact that an evil fascist like Franco was trying to help Che Guevara and Juan Perón, conspire to hurt the U.S. empire. That's why, Hispanicism is something that goes really far beyond just political autistic ideology.
You see it in the cartels too. The cartels normally don't attack other Hispanic people unless they directly interfere with the trade. Most of the drug trade, as it goes up to America, is actually meant to get Anglos or white Americans or just gringos entirely addicted to the drugs.
Well, what's his name? Carlos Leder, who was half German, half Colombian. He openly said in one of his radio broadcasts in which he'd have supermodels literally giving him blowjobs as he's shouting death to America. He would say things like cocaine is like a gift from God in which it's our atomic bomb against the gringo Yankees.
Even had Nazis after the war that worked at the cartel.
Yeah, well, Leder actually had a swastika tattooed on his arm, But he was kind of he wasn't like a Nazi. I don't know, whatever.
He formed a national Latino movement in Colombia, which
an actual legit party that was.
And he won seats in Congress, and he was openly saying that the Hispanic race is the most powerful on earth and that they need to dominate North America.
Yeah. He was in tune with the concept of raza cósmica, which comes from Vasconcelos in the 1920s. He was in tune with the concept of La Patria Grande.
And I just want to say something really quickly on the topic of La Raza Cósmica, because we brought this up in our refute to Eric Stryker on the YouTube channel, and I know Eric Stryker is going to be listening to this. What's funny is one of the top influences on Vasconcelos, on the cosmic race, which I did the audiobook of on my channel, was a Uruguayan author. And that's kind of like a funny thing that Eric doesn't want to talk about. It's that Uruguay and Argentina are ostensibly mestizo nations. They were founded that way. The average white person in Uruguay is, if you do a genetic test on them, they're like 80 to 85% white, with the rest being American Indian. Like, these are just, for the most part, light-skinned mestizos, but you have people like Eric Stryker, which is really weird to me, saying that like South Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay should form like a white ethno-state, even though these are mixed people. These are not people who the leaders of white nationalism would want dating their daughters. You know what I mean?
And even if they're not mixed, because there are people you find who might be pure, like the culture, the worldview, the outlook, like, is still mixed. You know what I mean? Like, you could be a nearly pure black from the Chocó region of Colombia, but like, you probably will still consider yourself a mestizo. Like, it's not such an autistic, like, very specific definition. It's like, it's almost like an essence, a spirit, if you will.
Yeah, because again, the other metaphysical axioms are considered when forming identity, whereas with the gringos, it's not. It's literally genos, and that's it.
Well, and there's something else you guys need to understand as well, where a lot of Americans who are going to listen to this podcast, they have this idea of the Creole elites that live in Latin America. They have this idea that these are like pure white Spaniards.
Were you talking to a woman who actually disagrees with your movement earlier?
Yeah. She's got like 85 subs, and yeah, she was literally shilling for capitalism right after in another stream. I'm not gonna say anything about her, but my point is that
Oh, sorry about that then.
No, don't even worry. She's not gonna ever hear this. It doesn't matter. But my point is that the Creole elites of Latin America, these are people who are the descendants of Spanish nobility who also intermarried with Indian nobility, like the Aztec nobility as well.
No. Wait. Hold on. They're not necessarily descendants.
Well, a lot of them are, is my point. A lot of them are.
Most criollos did come from like almost pure Spanish. Of course, they have a little bit of, probably they have a black grandma too. But they're actually more the merchant class that arose here in the Americas. And a lot of them are also very much mixed in with conversos.
Something I've heard up before, actually.
Yeah, keep going, Noel.
Oh.
I just want to clarify that the not necessarily they're nobles. No, they're more, if anything, come from merchant class people, and they tend to be from people who participated in the black market trade with England when the crown wasn't allowing them. At least that was the case for Simón Bolívar, and tons of.
Seems
other
like everywhere you go, the merchant is the problem.
Yeah, it is. I think when you look at kind of the medieval ideal, the merchant is somewhere in the middle of society. Whereas you look at our world today, the merchant is at the top of society. And so it's like, do you have
the merchant was lower than the fucking peasant.
Yeah, that's true.
It's all lower.
That's true.
Ancient China, the merchant was the lowest of the low. Like, he wasn't even given any respect. Like, there were certain clothes that he was forced to wear so that everyone would know that he's a merchant. So the emperor was very clear that the merchant was the worst.
In some places in Europe, it was even illegal for merchants to even travel into cities or towns. In some areas, they could only go outside of the town or the city and talk to people or do business with them as they're entering the city.
Right.
Yeah, they were kind of seen as the Hindu caste system, the Dalits, like the untouchables. Like, these are people who deal in dirty dealings. You know, they touch money, and you know, there was kind of an aversion towards that. So yeah, I just want to clarify a little bit about the criollos. And the criollos aren't exclusively white. There's Indio criollos too. There was merchant classes amongst the Indians as well, and of course they merged well with the merchants of Iberia. So kind of interesting history there.
Does anyone have an issue with
definitely is
marrying aristocracy? I would assume not, right?
What was the question?
Does anyone have an issue with aristocracy marrying aristocracy? Because I've noticed that they don't really care about that at all. So if the aristocracy,
it seems like merchants want to be aristocracy nowadays.
Oh yeah, I know that, but I'm saying like a lot of these white nationalists and black nationalist types, they all think that they are themselves aristocracy when they're not.
Oh, they're not.
No, they're usually quite the opposite, if anything.
Like even the broad term that was used by people like Gross or von Heckel for like Aryan, for example, in German, that was more of like a spiritual umbrella. It really wasn't like a temporal thing. And like the spiritual umbrella for it was more like what type of values the person adhered to and they followed as an individual. If we use those type of things like religiosity, for example, or say like Prussian values from like Prussianism and socialism, like there's really nobody in America that would actually fit that term if they were like like white German or like really anybody. Nobody would. Not even modern Germany would follow that term. Like I've talked with like people about this before. Like I'm mostly Anglo. I don't really consider myself white. I'll call myself an Anglo, but what I think when it comes in terms of America, though, is that the country is so dysfunctional and rootless. It almost needs like a new identity or something new to overtake what's currently here. Hispanista people or the Hispanic people probably already have something they can kind of take from that's already there.
Well,
like
and we can go back and forth. We can go back and forth, which Europeans, for the most part, don't really do because of the distance. Like, a lot of people in the Southwest, they can, on the weekends or maybe every other month or so, drive or take a plane to Mexico or somewhere in South America, and they can refill from the cultural well and, practice the language, reabsorb the culture. Early on in American history, like, an Irish guy goes to California, he's not going back to Ireland. That's it. It's over. And it's like, it's unfortunate. I wish ethnic Europeans that are living in the United States the best, in that I hope that they hold on to their ethnic identity as much as possible, because if you lose your ethnic roots and you just become white, you're done, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Like, it's kind of like when I talk with like pacifist here, is that I actually went through my family and I was actually able to find like real certificates that were actually showed that my family had like roots to like actual like English aristocracy, which is kind of a meme. But like, I actually do want to go to Europe and actually visit like the countrysides in England, probably Ireland, maybe Scandinavia. I actually want to visit these countries. I don't know if I can now because stuff that happened about a year ago. I'm probably on a no-fly list, but that's a different conversation.
I want to go back to what you said about Aryan, because the term aristocrat actually comes from the Greek aristokratos, which literally means rule of the Aryans. So the aristocrats, as you correctly pointed out, are the Aryans. They're synonymous. If you're Aryan, you're an aristocrat, and if you're an aristocrat, you're Aryan.
Right. And the concept is like this nobility, right? Like this nobility of character and like beauty,
Yep.
Correct. That's correct.
An objective beauty in the Platonic or Aristotelian sense, kind of like what Roger Scruton talks about. I know like Giovanni would probably disagree with that, as that goes against like the futurism stuff, but
yeah, I don't like classical art. It's not that I don't like classical art. I do like modern art, though. I think art should reflect the era that it's made in. I don't do the return to tradition shit. Like, we should look forward, be innovative and progressive.
Actually, part of your dislike of, say, like white nationalists and National Socialism actually isn't the stuff we're talking about. It's more so the traditional aspects that's actually rooted in the ideology, like aesthetics, for example.
It's anti-modern and regressive and romantic.
Return to the suburbs, white man.
Yeah, like what is American tradition? Like they're white nationalists who talk about returning to tradition are usually talking about like 1950s suburbia, and I can't
run
think
away
of a
from
more...
black people in the cities and just be a fucking white person with no roots, white man.
Exactly. White flight is their tradition. Like, it's gay. Like, aim a little higher than that. Like, if you're gonna LARP and like return to tradition, at least like aim for something higher than 1950s suburbia. Like, I can't think of anything more mediocre.
That's why white nationalists are really intimidated by Hispanics a lot, because Hispanics are known, and especially in the Southwest, for going to very black areas, buying out all the homes, working as a cohesive ethnic group to solidify and gain more power in all these neighborhoods. White people now just run away just anytime a brown person approaches their neighborhood, and it's just like, who's going to win civilizationally when this is your attitude of just, run away, keep going further, keep going on an extra exit on the highway, don't have any confrontation, stay out of the city, just go to the suburb or just be in a trailer park. It's like, this is the signs of people decaying that don't really want to hold on to power anymore. That's how I ultimately view it.
You also have to understand that, there's been a lot of laws working against us consistently that prevents us from actually forming these communities.
The cities are the cultural hubs. Like, if you abandon them to foreigners, then foreigners are going to dictate what the culture of your country is going to be. Like,
I know trying to do like the anti-suburban stuff and make like these like agrarian communes up in Cascadia. You kind of had that with like Northwest Imperative and say like the Aryan Nations. That ended up
going to grow weed farms together.
Well, the Aryan Nations ended up failing because like a couple members decided to assault people who were just walking by the property, and the entire commune basically got taken away by the state. And I believe now, like, even when it comes to like state policies, they have stuff against us. Anon, I helped them out with a script on it. We're basically talking about a lot of the stuff that they do to try and prevent communities like that from forming in the first place.
So you're talking about like policies put in like by the Department of HUD, for example. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be trials if you want to, essentially put your place on the North America as the Aryan overman. But, you can cry about double standards 24/7, or you can, try to just deal with the issues as they are.
I mean, what crying about double standards? Because there is none of that. It's just like, I think that most people who are white, who did try to form these communities a long time ago, they constantly got busted up by the government every time they tried. And a lot of them, it's their natural inclination to try and do things in a lawful manner. So when you can't do it in a lawful manner, a lot of people just gave up and stopped doing it.
Well, I think it's true. Like, you had Ruby Ridge, right? And
yep.
But
Waco's not quite the same, but yeah.
I think the issue is the unifying principle. If you make, to touch on this concept of like kind of the Amerima ethnogenesis, right? What's the unifying principle? If the unifying principle, especially the first one, is your skin color, then like it's just never going to work. The unifying principle in an ethnos needs to be a metaphysical, divine, mystical concept that's outside of the human flesh, right? It needs to be something immaterial.
Willing to die.
I mean,
for,
I think most white Americans that form communities also happen to be very religious communities.
Yeah, but they tend to be heretical. Maybe.
No. Protestant communities.
Yeah.
He said heretical,
but that's You see, and maybe I have a bias because I'm
you're Catholic,
Orthodox Catholic. Well, I'm Orthodox.
Anon is
right.
Protestant, by the way. I'm not religious at all, so like I don't really care too much, but.
Yeah, I'm Protestant. I grew up around a lot of these white Protestant communities. Like, they weren't evangelical; they were Reformed Presbyterian communities, and I've seen a lot of them. There's still plenty of them to this day that are very cohesive groups that live together, work together, and that's
it's definitely better than my white skin or Thor or whatever the hell.
There's always going to be like
stuff.
Black people or Hispanic people sprinkled into these groups, but typically they're majority white, and they don't have like they pretty much purged prejudice out from amongst themselves.
Yeah, like you got
censored. But hold on, real quick. Let me Let me make this real clear here. I understand that departments like HUD are, I'm purposely looking up like the whitest zip codes in the country and are attempting to put like Black Americans there. Like, I get that. But let's use another people as an example to sort of, see similar situations occur. So, for example, if we look at the Palestinian people in Israel, look at what Israel does to these people on a regular basis and how
they literally bulldoze their homes.
Exactly. But my point is that the Palestinians are, they are a very powerful ethnic group that, for the most part, is united under Islam. And Islam, is this unifying force for the most part among these people in
like
resisting Israeli occupation. There's some parallels, absolutely. And my point is that obviously I am completely for nonviolence in everything that I do. But it's like, if you observe a Palestinian, he's willing to blow himself up for the cause if he has to in order to advance the interests of his people.
Support from anybody.
But white nationalists, they're scared of even getting doxxed, or else they think their life's going to be ruined. And they think that if they lose their white collar job, it's the end of the world for them. So it's like, who's going to win when you have these sorts of conflicting worldviews? Someone that's willing to blow themselves up, or someone that's scared to even say that they don't like Black people behind their own name and face? It's obvious to me who's going to win.
I know some guys that were brave enough to say the N-word.
Oh, you mean like on a Omegle to like 13-year-olds?
Yeah, I think half those guys are Mexican too, like Brandon Martinez. That's the thing. It's Mexicans like Martinez doing this too. I think because white people don't want to do it.
Well, I think the problem with white nationalists and white supremacists is that they do tend to gather a lot of these like oddballs and these strange people who even recognize these things to begin with. Because in general. Right, because the liberal order that exists among the most common Anglos, right, says that you can't be prejudiced. So if you're coming into this and you're like, well, I want to establish an entire group around being white, well, you're only going to attract the other people who are already the outcasts. The people who already have cohesive white communities are the people who reject.
Well, American Third Position of like Culture Thug kind of has the more idea like. You can push like a culturally like white thing is what they say, but if you push like overt white nationalism, you're basically going to alienate whites, which is why they push like a rainbow coalition stuff.
Well, exactly. If you want to get the normal and the healthy whites, usually you have to not be a prejudiced white person.
We shouldn't even really be using the term white, really. But...
Well, I mean, I know what you mean.
I've said this before, and this is kind of like a thought experiment for any white nationalists that are listening. Like, how do friends, family, neighbors, etc., respond when you tell them that you want to promote the interests of the white race? I can tell you, myself personally, when I tell friends, neighbors, family members that I want to promote the interests of Hispanic people, they get it. They're not like these. They don't automatically go into like, oh my God, you're a Nazi mode, because this is something that's organic to us. This is something that's real, something that transcends race altogether.
Plus, there hasn't been a propaganda campaign against you for the last, 50 years.
No, there has, actually. There's been the Black Legend propaganda, which, Latinxers actually spread all the time. And they're the ones that are being astroturfed. And Noel can tell you all about this.
Even though Raza has a pretty warped view of like Hispanic identity. In America, at least. Like the organization, the Raza.
Like, Noel, can you kind of fill them in on like sort of how these sorts of Latinxers, like radical Latino, are being propped up by these mainstream white liberals, and how these are the sorts of people that they want Hispanic people our age to be following?
Well, isn't the Latinx people, aren't they a relatively new phenomenon?
Yeah, they are. It's totally new, but I mean, it's not just with clown ass radical Latino, but it's like through academia, especially, where they're kind of exporting this identity politics. Not just around race, but even around gender, around
sexuality.
Yeah, gender, sexuality,
like intersectionality, basically.
Yeah, just all anything and everything. And this is like what the U.S. Embassies are doing in our countries. Like there's documentary evidence of them hiring, essentially social workers to handle these different, the Afro-Mexican phenomenon and the abuse of women in El Salvador or whatever, to foment these kind of divisions. Right now you're seeing a huge protest in Colombia, which may be rooted in some legitimate things, but you'll see that most of the rhetoric of the young people at the protest, if you ask them, like, what's the problem here? Like, they're pretty much woke culture, bitching and complaining with no real solution to anything.
I would argue it's similar to Occupy Wall Street in that it started out as something very organic, and then the elites, the powers that be, are like, okay, there's clearly something happening, and we got to control what's going on here. And then they're going to try and basically, since they can't stop these protests from occurring, they're going to try and lead it and corrupt it from within. Which the CIA's had a long history of doing this successfully.
Sure. But I think it's the culture of the youth who's been informed by kind of these liberal American foreign values.
And not just academia, Noel, but also it's important to state as well, I would argue stuff like woke Netflix specials that are targeted for young Latin Americans, that does 100 times more damage than what some kooky professor at a university has to say.
Music, the entertainment industry, which all is connected.
Reggaeton, all of this stuff.
It's all connected to, American record companies. So, I think the intention is one of the things, if you guys want to kind of understand the Hispanic dynamic, that I think you should definitely read is Samuel Huntington's The Hispanic Problem or Issue or Question or something like that. This is written in 2004, where he kind of talks about like unique dynamics of Hispanics that are going to present problems if we think they're just like the Irish or the Italians. And I think, like Babylon got busy from that point and has been trying to find a way to deconstruct kind of a Hispanic ethnic or civilizational identity.
I see what you're saying. So basically, the system has been hard at work trying to deconstruct Hispanic identity, but there isn't like an easy
system targets
word.
all groups.
Right, exactly. Saying. Yes, you're right, but there isn't as like even to this day there is a form of accepted like Hispanic identity, whereas there isn't necessarily that for quote unquote white.
Well, in the Balkans, they did this by forcing one of the countries, I think it was Kosovo, into legalizing homosexuality, where they threatened to actually use military force. They legalized it, and like a week later, they're having like pride parades.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Totally. I mean, it is a culture
right now.
And I think what you're seeing with, in the U.S. is that, again, they're trying to get us to have some kind of a racial identity, which is really hard because most of us are extremely mixed. And you might have a fairer complexion or a darker complexion, but the issue is when you have really mixed genetics and you marry and have kids with someone with mixed genetics, is that your kids could theoretically look like your great-grandparents. You get what I'm saying? Like, they're not necessarily going to be the same skin color as you. Sorry.
And this is why we actually talked about this when we were debunking Eric Stryker's stuff, because if someone who's Hispanic and they look white, like Brandon Martinez, for example, if they take up this ideology where these mestizos just go off how you look, well, then you're going to put entire siblings and family members against each other because, for example, I'm the darkest skinned guy in my family. I have family members. I have siblings that look whiter than Stryker and Martinez, despite the fact that we're mestizo. But my point is that if my family were to adopt this sort of racial dynamic, we would just be a million different like racial groups that just hate each other. And like who ultimately benefits at the end of the day if we're dividing ourselves based on how we look phenotypically, despite the fact we're all mixed? Well, it's the elites at B.
Well, it's the what we call jam culture, right? Judeo-Anglo-Masonic culture. The Atlantis is the West. Whatever you want to.
Did you make that up?
Yeah, I did.
Oh my gosh, I have a very similar one that I made up. I call it JMAS, Judeo-Masonic Anglo-American Soviet. Very close.
That's pretty cool.
That's very impressive.
Yeah. They win because, again, I think to overlook the demographic moment is another mistake. Like, we have to understand that it's a very interesting demographic moment when you want to compare, like, Americans, whether they're white or black, to Hispanic America. Like, if you include Brazil, there's 700 million of us. And the average age is in our early to mid 20s, whereas you look at the American population, it's in the 50s and almost 60s. And so this is an interesting demographic situation where it's like, how do we divide this quote unquote horde of people? Well, let's get the ones with the kinkier hair to think that they're black.
This is giving me some high, low versus the middle type of vibes from like Neo Reaction, if you know about that.
No, I'm not familiar.
The whole basis of high-low versus the middle is it's trying to use class distinctions and like class distinctions like in a Marxist understanding. So like you have racial, you have economic class, and you have like broader intersectional issues that are pushed by people in the elite and institutions, just the culture and the base itself. And it's used is an indirect alliance with people who are of the low to basically attack the middle. The middle are basically like the normal people, like petty bourgeois people who actually maintain culture and religiosity. And it does that by to essentially weaken and destroy them so it can permanently have sustain itself. And you also have like high, middle versus low, which is where the high aligns itself with the middle and maintains culture. This is talked about like in books like Machiavellian's Defenders of Freedom, which it says that people that are like true Machiavellians are like true manipulative like leaders that usually would align themselves with things like that, like Mussolini, for example, when he aligned himself like the church. If you kind of get what I mean.
Yeah, I understand. And so I think that's the issue. And so it's interesting because what's being promoted is this Afrocentrism, especially amongst Hispanics of the Caribbean region, because obviously you have more of an African admixture. Right. And you're seeing more in Mesoamerica, this push of indigenism, but you see indigenism in other parts of South America as well, where they are trying to get you to identify with, like, you're the Indian. You're not the Spanish, that the reason why you have a full beard and a unibrow.
And your last name's like Hernandez.
Yeah. You're and it's the irony is that you see, like, it's
fine with the losers and not your actual paternal roots.
Many indigenous identifying people tend to be whiter. And so it's just
like Batista.
Yeah, it's just the irony of kind of what they call magic realism.
Kind of reminds me of pagans and the white nationalist movement. It's like it's a dead culture. It's like a dead religion and culture entirely. But they're literally just atheists that are following like a religious archetype, kind of like the Church of Satan. Yeah. So, what's interesting is that the Afrocentrism, the indigenism is actually it's feeding Hispanism, because it's like people are starting to like, and this was a kind of, last year was a very interesting year, I think, for Hispanics, especially in the US, where they kind of started to gain consciousness of self and started looking at like, oh, we don't fit in here quite the way these people want us to fit in here. We kind of have our own thing. And then it's like,
well, explain the context of like what was going on last year for everybody.
It was all the George Floyd shit, and then the Antifa kids, the Black Lives Matter, burning down cities, doing all the bullshit they were doing. And if you notice, like, it was Hispanics being kind of the heroes, like punking these kids, telling them to go home, or like shooting
rooftop Koreans.
It was like more like Hispanics on the ground. Like you saw it in South Chicago, where they weren't letting like the Black Lives Matter enter into certain Hispanic neighborhoods.
Yeah, Latin Kings were defending that.
Yeah, you saw the Chainsaw Man
couple stand out with guns, and they got called out by the media.
That was totally that lawyer couple kind of paid for that. Like it was like a PR stunt. But like
you have me too, who was like banned by the FBI for edge posting.
I was really surprised last year because I always keep my mouth shut about my politics or anything like that. But I work with a lot of Hispanic women, and like I remember them like turning on the TV and saying, what does this N-word have to do with us? And like I was like, what the hell? Like, at least none of them were bitching about the stupid BLM shit at all. And I was like, wow, that was pretty awesome to hear.
Yeah. No, I mean,
and what's interesting as well. And what's interesting is like there was a conquistador statue that these predominantly white Antifas were trying to take down in New Mexico. And a Hispanic kid, or not a kid, an adult, like shot the kid. Like he shot the guy that was trying to destroy the statue. And you saw an interesting situation where Hispanics in the U.S. and their neighborhoods ethnically were defending their territory from black and white gringos that were leading these BLM protests. These BLM protests were not just, black people doing this. And it wasn't just whites on their own either. It was this mix of like anarchists and black activists and black opportunists who wanted to loot and riot. And Hispanics kind of asserted themselves in that moment and defended their neighborhoods. And the rest of the country was really looking in awe. And you had a lot of people saying like, oh, like, Hispanics, they're pretty based. They're like at least half European. Like, man,
yeah, all
really
of a sudden Nick Fuentes changes. There's a tape of Nick Fuentes in 2019 saying,
Can I butt in for a second real quick, if I may?
Go ahead. I'll make
I wanted to say this real quick. This just goes to show just how, whether they're black or white, bourgeois versus proletariat, all these liberals are exactly the same. At the end of the day, they'll all coalesce together and work together as liberals against the cultured peoples of the world.
That's so funny, dude, because you guys know Southern Dingo?
Yeah. He's a Spurg.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's some white nationalist.
by the way.
Yeah, that guy sucks.
Who
He
tries
appears
to,
on the kill stream a lot.
Yeah, I have kind of beef with him online. And then this radical Latino faggot who's like a Latinxer.
He's 20% black, but he calls himself black. It's
and
like
he calls me a white supremacist, by the way. He calls me a white supremacist. He says that I'm a Nazi. These guys actually got on a stream together to talk shit about me.
Dingo and fucking Radical Latino had a one struggle in which they're like literally calling Noel a Jew and like claiming that he's like this shady guy and that like he's just horrible, and it's like it doesn't shock me actually that
dude they were all calling me a Fed like a year ago because of disavowed siege and said I don't support genociding like an entire ethnic group of people.
Of course, it's fucking dumb. But what was it, Noel, that you were finishing off with?
I wanted to touch on 2020 that
and Nick was talking about Mexicans, right? I think that's what you were going into. Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes was describing Mexicans.
That's right. Yeah, in 2019, he's talking shit about, these Mexicans are going to take over and we're all going to be Mexican because of them. And then in 2020, he's like, my base Mexicans fucking beating up all the blacks for me. So it's just fucking funny. But, I think 2020 did mark a turning point where now that Hispanismo movement that has been growing in Spain and in South America is now coming north of the border. And so it's a very interesting moment, I think, to see where this can potentially go because the reality is that when a Latin American embraces his Hispanic heritage and kind of just begins this process of dispelling the Black legend, that's wrapped in with the traditional church, right? It's like they're both one and the same. So the rejection of our Spanish heritage is part and parcel of the rejection of the church. And so when you start kind of undoing, the Black legend that makes you reject this, you pull both of those things back together. And so now it's like we're kind of at the edge of the cliff here where we've seen where the West has gone. And we're asking ourselves, do we really want to go that way? Or do we kind of want to go back or maybe to the right or to the left to a different place that's more congruent with who we are and our historical development, both the good phases and the bad phases of it. And so that's kind of like this moment that Hispanics are having, millennials and Zoomers specifically. So, that's kind of an interesting situation to be in.
No, like I actually support that. Like personally, like even when it comes to like wider looking Hispanics, I don't support them identifying with white nationalism. And it's not because I don't dislike them. It's partly because it's their actual identity, and I don't think it's right to do like the genetic theft shit that most white nationalists actually advocate for. But yeah, I think it's a good thing that America balkanizes too. That like you guys take California, New Mexico, and Texas. Like that's just my opinion.
You can have Texas. I don't want
probably trigger some people of me saying that though. Like I'm okay as long as I got Ohio and I can stay in Ohio.
I mean, we have no historical claim to places like Ohio, and it wouldn't even make sense demographically to try and take these places.
It's like mostly German, I believe.
Yeah. What's funny is a lot of these white nationalists, they're getting very, very threatened by our presence. Like, we've invited a lot of people to just have a normal talk with us. Sorry,
real quick. No, just real quick. Let me add in. And the Black nationalists, because the Black nationalists are trying
to steal our Dominicans as well. Yeah, this is a big thing.
They want to steal the people from the islands. They want to steal the quote unquote Afro Mexicans, which are actually Zombos. They're half Indian, half Black. They're
Costeño Colombians también.
They want to whisper things that cause conflict, division, and resentment within our world. But they're being pushed back, and they're like fucking pissed off. These last 2 days, I've been like stuck somehow in streaming this corner of YouTube with the Afrocentrics, and they're fucking pissed because we're not letting them easily have, our chocolatey Dominican cousins or whatever. And they're starting to reject it and say, like, no, you want me to be black so that you can boss me around, and then you get to define what black is. And so, I'd rather just kick it with my cousins.
Yeah, and conversely, the white nationalists are getting like we have invited a lot of these people just to chill and just have a normal chat with us. People like Eric Stryker, a lot of these people, they refuse to talk to us. They'll debate literal Antifas that dox their own comrades, but they won't talk to people like us. And not only that, but then not only will they ignore our request to talk, I've had people like Patrick Little literally message me the other day and he's just straight up calling me a Jew and saying that like I'm working with the Jews or I am a Jew to like destroy TRS. And it's like, dude, we have.
Are you working with the Jews? Are you working with the Jews?
I haven't heard of him in a long time.
Patrick Little works for TRS now at this point. He's their butt boy. And yeah, it's really sad, but it's just like these people won't even engage with us except to just message us privately, like accusing us of being Jews. And it's just really pathetic.
Or Russian agents.
I don't really have any problems with Dugan doing his own thing. Like Martinez and the SP guy can spurg about that. I personally think it's a good thing that America falls apart and like different.
Let's talk about Martinez a little bit. So what is the main beef that he's been having with you guys? Because on our end, it's just kind of like, here's kind of what I've noticed. I feel like Martinez is this really annoying situation for white nationalists in that he's obviously off-white. This guy's clearly a mestizo probably. And on the lighter side, of course. But my point is that he says a lot of things, in my opinion, that white nationalists only keep quietly, like behind closed doors, and he's saying that shit out loud. So what do I mean? If we use like the recent Israel-Palestine situation, he's
doing the race first shit too.
Right, he's doing race first. He's saying that like, oh, like these Palestinians, they're invading our country, they're invading Europe. Why should we, do one struggle with them?
When
they're our
enemies
enemies?
To be non-white too, which is kind of funny. But
yeah, but it's just like it's really strange, and it's like he's saying the stuff out loud that these people want to avoid because they have a much better PR team now, is what I would say.
Well, I think that we disagree with a lot of what Martinez says. I think a lot of us have, grown out of this whole like white supremacist, we need to be violently Wignat kind of thing. And we're moving on to something a lot more mature. And Martinez is stuck being like this capitalist dipshit where he just wants to preach all day about like white people should do this. White people can be the masters of any economic system, which we all know is bull.
Well, even a year ago, when I was pushing like sophism and like radical relativism and like will to power, existentialism, all religions bad, only will to power, imperialism type stuff, I wasn't talking about genociding other groups. I was talking about doctrining them into a giant culture and having a global empire type situation. I wasn't talking about like racial supremacy even back then. Even when I affiliated with some of the people in the Siege crowd, which means I had a big disparity with them in like a worldview right there, just depending on like what I wanted, because they would want to do exterminationism, for example, which I think is kind of unpractical. Like a National Socialist order, like only the world should be inhabited by the Aryan man, which is kind of autistic. It's really autistic. Like it's not really practical, like even then there, and it's dehumanizing, but.
So here's what I would say real quick. Actually, keep going. I'll say it after. My bad. Keep going.
My problems with Martinez isn't so much that he's like, say, like a non-white calling himself a white guy, LARPing as a Spaniard. There's other people who do have a problem with him over that. Yeah. My problems with him is one, he pushes like hardcore MGTOW rhetoric, which basically just makes him a really cool homosexual in my view.
Oh yeah, that.
And my other problem is that he denies that, say, fascism, National Socialism, phalangism, like whatever you want to call it, third position is not socialist. It is socialist because corporatism is a form of socialism. It's an outgrowth of guild socialism, which comes from Catholic social teaching. He can spurg about it all he wants. That's what it is. He's not a fascist. He's just a generic white nationalist going around with like drug brain people who don't even read theory. And they just want to do like white supremacy, race first type stuff. Most of them are racist liberals because they still believe in capitalism. Yes, capitalism is a form of liberalism. So no matter what you say, you're just a racist liberal. And but they don't understand anything out of that. It's not so much the racial question on that. Like, it's probably like another problem I have with him. But the main problem is that he's pushing misinformation and he doesn't understand the type of stuff that he's pushing in the first place.
Yeah, and what's really funny
I
is
completely agree.
Hold on. What's really funny is the racist liberals, they push this very schizophrenic message, which is like really, really dumb. I don't care if they want to keep pushing it. I mean, it just helps my cause, so you can keep doing it. But it's kind of like this sentiment. It's like this. It's like, look, man, all you non-whites, you guys are oppressing me because I'm superior to you. And it's all because I'm just really compassionate. We're just so altruistic, and we just let it happen. But then simultaneously, I'm also a super predator. And also, I was your ancestors, like, you know, before they degenerated and race mixed like the Persians. Like, it's this very, and then the Apollonians, I remember back on Twitter, they were like the worst example of like this sort of thought.
Yeah, the Mark Brahman crowd.
Yeah, and it's just like, you know, how are you going to claim that you're, you know, the overman, but then at the same time you're just like this, it's like you're the temporarily inconvenienced overman. You're just like you're in this weird state where it's like all you can do is whine about double standards all day. Like, that's not what a genuine Nietzschean ideal of the overman, that's not how this person would ever behave.
Well, they're doing slave morality for one when you use Nietzsche, but
I do have to say this. This is exactly why I sometimes LARP as an African-American Negro from Chicago online. I just do it to piss these people off.
Oh, yeah, that's funny. I have a history of doing that, but that's a whole nother story.
Well, they also see because you're married to a white woman, I believe, too, and then you say you're anti-white.
My wife is not white. She's not white.
Oh, they say that she's German for some reason. A lot of them do.
I don't understand why. She doesn't identify as white. I don't see her as white. I see her as Swiss German. So I don't know. I don't get it.
Remember that voice message of you going around where you said, "I'm glad to be part of the downfall of the white race." That makes me seem so bad.
Basically, it's an 11-second voice message, and it ends with, you know, how do I feel about the genetic destruction of the European peoples? I'm like, not gonna lie, feels pretty good, man. Feels pretty good. I did that to troll a bunch of Wignats that raided my chat, and this was the response to that. So now that's been archived by some Spurg who's going around sharing it everywhere, trying to incite the whole world against me. But whatever, it was worth it.
You even have like you have a lot of anti-Anglo memes too. I've shown Billy before that he liked.
Yeah, I got like our entire chat is probably more anti-Anglo than anti-Jewish, but it's a meme. We just do it to poke fun at Wignats.
Well, it's because a lot of them are political Jews themselves. Like even Reinhard Heydrich's. I have like the book, The Idea of National Socialism, Third Reich books.com. It talks about how like the idea of like German racial theory was different than like Anglo racial theory. And he calls like the Anglo racial theory basically Jewish racial theory because a lot of them are basically trying to be Jews.
In a very real sense, the Germanic racial theory is actually very similar to what these guys here have been spouting about the Hispanic racial theory. It's very similar. It also puts
Oh, is it? Is that?
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean, Hindu?
Yeah, James Greger argues that in that essay I sent. Like at the end, it basically became more of a spiritual doctrine, not so much of a temporal doctrine.
The focus is actually on German culture in general, which includes the other metaphysical axioms mentioned before. So, as I said, ethos, pathos, logos, these are all important aspects of German identity. White identity completely undermines that. So, yeah, you cannot be German and white. You can only be one or the other.
Yeah, like we sent that to a news reporter who wanted to have me on a documentary on white supremacy. I sent them a video by Pacifist talking in the Indian accent about how the Nazis were anti-white.
Yes.
You guys I remember. I wanted to touch on that real quick. I think it should be understood that Germany being this place that's like half Catholic, half Protestant, it's like it still has a connection to this pre-Enlightenment worldview, this Christendom, this kind of Romanitas type of worldview, whereas England completely cut itself off from it.
So the reason for that is because the Protestant Reformation in Germany was actually very controlled. if you do a little bit of studying, you'll find that Luther actually, when it came to the more radical elements that were advocating for uprisings, peasant revolts against the authorities, he actually sided with the authority of the states and the authority of the church.
That's
and he
correct,
told,
yeah.
he said all the rebels should be slaughtered because they're like mad dogs, and you got basically sided with the church. So even the Protestants in Germany are completely different from the quote unquote Protestants in Britain. Like these are two different types of people.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say the same with the rise of Protestantism in Hispanic America. A lot of Catholic, kind of more hardcore, like see a huge problem with it. And I understand where they're coming from. But the Protestants in Latin America are like more trad than the Catholics. Like they're the ones who have the big families. They're the ones who kind of keep the traditional home. And even though they're Protestant, if they walk by a cathedral, they still make the sign of the cross. You know what I mean?
Yeah, same thing in Germany. Like the Protestants in Germany are really, I guess it's a bit different now with the influence of America. But in the past, it was very similar. You know, Protestants and Catholics had a lot.
When it came to like disassociating with like the Catholic Church initially, most of the problems Luther had was over indulgences, I believe. And when it came down to like more radical Catholic sects, he never disavowed things like the Church Fathers or like the older doctrines and teachings that were in the Catholic Church itself. Whereas like more radical Protestant sects, like you have like in America nowadays, they outright reject the things like the Trinity, for example, which is completely like cult behavior.
And I mean, I've met someone that would even go as far as to say like Anglo Masonic quote unquote Christianity isn't even worthy of the title of Protestant because a Protestant is a protesting Catholic. These people are not Catholic at all. They don't even deserve the title of Protestant.
Interesting.
When it comes down to like a lot of the religious stuff, like even though I'm personally not religious like you guys, like in that sense, but it seems like with like America, Protestantism it's very heavily ingrained with like Gnostic teachings.
Yeah, American Protestantism is a meme. It's literally Freemasonry LARPing as Christianity. It's not even Protestantism. I would still say
Jews half the time too.
I think even when it comes to like religiosity, like within Christianity, I believe you can still be heretical and you can still be better than cult behavior. I believe most forms of Christianity in America is actually just cult behavior. It's not even real Christianity.
And all of it is protected by the U.S. Constitution.
Like even positive Christianity is technically heretical, but that's still better than what we have right now.
I would argue only in the sense that it's saying that the state has the right to govern temporally, and that the state won't be used as a religious tool to persecute heretics. That any affairs regarding theology should be settled peacefully within the realm of temporal law. In other words, nobody wants another 30 years war, right? Because that was a huge tragedy in Germany. So that's all it was. It was just saying, hey, Protestants and Catholics, you guys can work out your issues through theological debates and discussions. But, the state will maintain its temporal authority. And and the state won't be used as a tool for religious political organizations.
Well, and that's how Freemasons got their foot in the door after a 30 years war in which they were like, hey, let's stop fighting because of this stuff. And then they, as a way, they try to set up this fraternity of Christians, which eventually devolved into like modern jam culture that we see today. If that makes sense.
There's a distinction, though, because Freemasons advocated for the privatization of faith, so you were not supposed to publicly profess your faith.
Right.
Positive Christianity said the opposite. It encouraged Catholics to be vocal about their Catholicism, but also said the Protestants should, and you guys settle it out through by talking to each other. Whereas Freemasonry says everyone shut up and let's all just keep it private and internalized. That's the difference.
Reminds me of the Soviet Union in that regard.
Right. It's crucial. It's a crucial difference.
I this is actually something interesting I do want to talk about real quick is like with the phalange, we're actually getting close to like wrap up time.
Sure. Yeah.
Where we normally do. So when it comes down to the phalange, you have people like Martinez basically push that Franco was woke on race and Jose Antonio wasn't woke on race or Jews, and therefore he's anti-white, and it's a good thing that he's dead. And he likes Franco because race stuff and woke on Jews, which isn't necessarily true because
Franco was actually a fellow Semite. He actually invited Sephardic Jews to come back to Spain. There's a lot of misconceptions about Franco in general. Actually,
Ramos is more anti-Semitic.
What's interesting about Franco is, and Jose Primera is, Franco's the only reason why people, for the most part, even remember Jose. He was the one that sort of like integrated the Falange into Francoism in general, into the government, and he was the one that kind of glorified Jose after his death afterwards. And it's important to understand that with Francisco Franco, he turned Spain into like the sixth most powerful economy on the earth. Like he massively industrialized Spain. He is the reason why, for example, that in the 1920s, Spain was like infrastructural wise, it was a shithole like any other part of like Latin America you would see today. Like it was not. Sure, I understand. Like you guys, you may not like him because you're more dedicated to fascism. But the thing is like what Franco did was much more organic with the Spanish people. And Franco at the same time was very much a Hispanista as well in many ways, and like helping out Latin Americans who wanted to break off from Spain and offering them, or not break off from Spain, break off from America, and that he supported them economically as well. It's just people just get very, very autistic about Franco because he didn't do a fascism basically. But in all ways, he basically did a pretty good job outside of picking his successor, which that's a mistake. Just that. It's something that goes across ideological lines. Like, it's just sometimes you can pick the wrong guy to go after you, and that's it. That's what I would say. But I'd be curious as to what your main issues were with Franco.
I don't like him because he wasn't a corporatist. He was a capitalist. It's not so much that he wasn't a fascist. You don't have to be a fascist to follow corporatism. And even if we look at the corporative structure that he set in place, he set it up specifically to where it was appointed by industrialists, so they would not side with working class people. That's my main complaint with Franco and why I do not like Franco. He didn't even follow Catholic social teaching in terms of the economic system. So I believe in that way you could actually call him a heretic. But that's my own complaint.
But Spaniards were doing substantially better economically, like under Franco, than before and after is the thing, though. Like he uplifted a lot of these people out of poverty and industrialized much of the country.
They were, but that was through like a gradual capitalist economic model, which I don't think is something you should support personally. Like even under the new economic policy in the Soviet Union, which had mass privatization, and it was only really controlled through syndicates, what helped like the Soviet Union go through a type of industrialization, which it was destroyed by Stalin because Stalin was a retard and didn't focus on consumer goods. But that's a different discussion.
That's pretty interesting. Have you ever done an episode on the CCP in China or kind of talking about these political or economic theories? I'm curious.
I do like the Chinese economic system because they actually coordinate their economy through trade unions and also firms, which regulates their cooperatives. So which is very similar to what Mussolini did, because like he actually had worker cooperatives in fascist Italy. You also had the state-owned trade unions, so which a lot of people don't know about the cooperatives. It's kind of funny when I bring it up to market socialists; they get butthurt about that.
Yeah. No, I'm really like kind of fascinated by it too. I'm just starting to dig into it, so that's why I asked if you've done any episodes.
I haven't yet.
Okay, cool.
I haven't.
Cool.
I do plan to talk with a dude I know from China that's going to talk about this. He's actually a member of the CCP.
Oh wow, that'd be really cool. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
Darn, you could maybe influence them to
still technically learning English though, so I'm waiting for him to get more fluent.
But once he becomes fluent, introduce him to labor economics. What I'm really hoping for is that China just increases its economic influence in the world more and more, and then eventually switches over to labor theory and labor economics.
I'm actually more in favor of China doing this than like Russia, and the reason why is because I actually see Russia as being irrelevant as a power. Economically, they have like the power of Italy, and even when it comes to like militarily, they only have the technology aspect, and they're actually being surpassed by China in that regard. And there's no incentive for them to ally with China as they become the subordinate partner in the relationship. which is why I think Dugin is largely irrelevant and a wacko in some regards, because Russia has more interest in maintaining status quo politics, because they would lose most of their influence in that regard, which is why they take status quo positions, especially like in the Middle East. Whereas China is engaging like in a form of like mercantilism nowadays, especially like a type of neo-colonialism. And it's surpassing the West entirely in every single regard, like it did even during the Qing Empire, which is far better and superior to the Roman Empire, which probably trigger some people.
Oh man.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with kind of what you're saying. This is more of a realistic take on Russia and China, I think. Hey,
and guys, just real quick to just jump back real quickly on the topic of Franco. I just want to make this clear, and then we can move on to any last topics you guys want real quickly. I respect Jose Antonio Rivera as sort of like an intellectual leader, but it's important to contextualize as well. This man never really fought IRL, like in battles and stuff. He was purely an intellectual. Franco was the kind of guy that, very early on in his life, he made a name for himself because he got shot in the stomach in Morocco. He ordered a medic, at gunpoint, holding a gun to him, saying, "You're going to stitch me up, even though you think I'm going to die." He like makes it out alive. He's like constantly like just been a badass his entire life. When he was in power, he made sure the proles actually had things like running water, electricity, which they didn't have prior to. He, set up the economy so that it was actually self-sufficient and not depending on all these other countries in order to survive. And that's important to understand, despite the fact that there were definitely flaws with the Franco regime. And I think, corporatism is ultimately going to be a model that's more preferred, generally speaking. But I was just curious, any other topics you want Noel and I to delve into before we finish this recording?
Actually, we could probably talk about Che Guevara, because I know like there's a lot of people in this side of the political scene. They tend to think like Che Guevara was like this big bad like Marxist that hated like fascists, for example. He was a bit more realpolitik, especially when it came to a lot of this stuff. And I know there's also a lot of admiration with movements, let's say like Casa Pound, Italia. They're huge fans of people like say Hugo Chavez, including Che Guevara.
Yeah, I know Billy obviously has read a lot more in depth about Che, but from kind of a perspective of a Nicaraguan, where Che is everywhere in Nicaragua. I think the proper way for people to understand Che is to understand that he was more of, I would describe him almost of an ethno-nationalist. Aside from the politics, like he had a Patria Grande worldview. He's before this kind of formalized Hispanista thing, but he was very much a precursor to it, because he kind of saw himself in contrast with the American empire, right? Like that's how his identity was formed. So I think that's the proper way to view Che. To get stuck on like his political labels or the choice of his rhetoric, whether it was left wing or right wing, I think is to kind of miss the real point of really what he was about.
Even his rhetoric actually shows like his real political leanings. Like one of the most popular things that came out of him, I think, was like Patria or Muerte. I might have butchered that, but it basically means fatherland or death.
That's exactly right. I think he comes from a generation that was still under the presumptions of the Black legend. It was a generation that didn't dispel the Black legend or question it. Sorry, that's my son typing away for some reason.
It's fine.
But he was definitely someone with that understanding of kind of a Hispanic civilization, a Hispanic macro ethnicity, if you want to kind of call it that. And he fought for it. I would definitely call him a passionary, someone who actually, gave his life to that struggle. And there's a lot of right-wing Hispanics that like just write him off because he's always a commie, and it's like you're missing the point of what this man really was.
They did that with Castro too, and like Castro.
The reality is that they had no choice, right? It was like the Americans weren't going to support them; the Soviets did. So, that was the same situation with the Sandinistas, right? So it's like,
and prior to Castro, when you had the Guatemala Revolution, like because they wouldn't side with the Soviets, the CIA just did a coup with the United Fruit Company, and that was it. It was over. Castro and Che saw what occurred, and Castro essentially made the final call because Che definitely was ideologically very much Marxist, along with Raul Castro, and these were minority viewpoints during the Cuban Revolution. Cuban Revolution, especially like the July 26th movement. A lot of these were reactionary type Cuban nationalists, many of whom even had like racialist sorts of views.
They were closer to phalangism ideologically, a lot of them.
Oh, yeah, a lot of them absolutely were. And, they were still able to work with other, Cubans that wanted to break off from Batista because, they had that Hispanic root in which that was able to unite them all, against the American Empire. And it's important as well to understand that people like Juan Domingo Perón, who, was a powerful mestizo leader of Argentina, he was one of the most noteworthy 20th century Hispanista, influencers in the world, in which in one of the writings he even created, he, openly pushed for a pan-Latin American, sort of like economic and military front. And Che Guevara very much agreed in these sorts of ideas. He believed that, he needed to, instead of trying to build up Cuba for the rest of his life, that he needed to try leading other revolutions in Latin America so that they could just, continuously keep breaking off from the American empire and finally create kind of like its own confederation that could stand against America on its own. And that's kind of like, again, even though he was Marxist, I would still very much say that I agree very much with what Che Guevara was fighting for, even if I'm not personally a Marxist myself. And I appreciate the fact that, he viewed himself as an ethnic comrade, as the same as any Bolivian or any black or any mestizo. He understood metaphysically what Hispanicity was about, and he embraced that. And yeah.
There's even similar aspects with people like this and say like Africa with like Thomas Sankara, who I actually like a lot. And he was sadly killed by the French, who basically supported people who killed him.
Yeah, and on the topic of Africa real quickly, I think it's important to mention as well that because this was a major thing in terms of like what Eric Stryker was doing in our refute that we did to him, in which he does racial deductionism. And he assumes anywhere you're going to find like people of mostly African ancestry that, they're just going to be essentially tricked by Jews into like trying to do a white genocide, which was he's saying is happening in South Africa. Now, I would just argue that, the colonial history of what occurs in your country is going to be very important in how it plays out now. So what do I mean by that? So let's use the Dominican Republic as an example compared to like South Africa. Dominicans are a mulatto people, ostensibly. These people are not persecuting or trying to kill white people for being white. They're not stealing their farms. They're not dying of starvation because they don't know how to farm. Dominicans are a very good example of a way in which, the African people were being, a large group of Africans were able to be absorbed into the Spanish Empire fully in every single way, including through mixing. And that, this is a much better situation than treating Bantus like they're animals for several centuries and then wondering why they want to murder you the second you emancipate them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I get it.
This is really interesting because there's a National Socialist literature from around 1938, especially within the German media. This is basically the German media. You can see this in a little book that was put together by the British that was exposing what the German propaganda was saying about Britain. And it's a book by the title of Beware of the English. That's what it's called. And in it, the Germans actually spend a lot of time in their media criticizing exactly this about America, that America was built on these liberal ideas and liberal values of identity, which led to ill treatment of certain groups of people, which of course led to Jim Crow. But then obviously the opposite of that would be emancipating all these people that have all these negative sentiments now. Basically, it was also criticizing the American order for having certain peoples be citizens, but still treating them like second class, which is completely foreign. It's a foreign idea on continental Europe, but part and parcel in Anglo-America.
Right. And what's really funny, too, about the South Africa situation is because South Africa was discovered such a long time ago initially by European colonizers, this was prior to really race existing as a concept. So, you had these early Europeans that would mix with the local Khoisan people and other tribes that were unique to this part of South Africa. I believe the Bantus more came sort of later. And as a
The Bantus
result,
killed the older like African blacks that were there because they were kind of genocidal themselves.
Right, yeah, the Bantu expansion was horrific, and that's something definitely people should look into historically. But what's funny is these people had intermixed with a lot of these local African tribes, and then after mixing, because race wasn't really a thing, they adopted racialist viewpoints, despite the fact that they were mixed, and it led to a lot of really wacky scenarios down the line as a result of them trying to be like, hey, we're white guys. You'd have situations where two people who look ostensibly white because they were mixed with African. Sometimes you get a child that looks like a very noticeably part African kid. And then there'd be entire court cases in South Africa, legislation, or not legislation, but there'd be court battles that would occur for several years in which they'd have to determine whether this South African is actually white or if he's colored. And I don't want a society that's modeled off of that. I think the way New Spain tried to incorporate all of the elements into the empire was much better in retrospect than something like, the way South Africa or America tried to deal with the topic of race.
Yeah, that was also the German criticism. So that's good, really good.
I believe part of the idea for imperial expansion too, that the Germans even held, is they didn't even want to do that expansion anymore. Because it would lead to more problems down the road.
That's why they were not as aggressive. They were satisfied with the colonies that they had, and they focused more on local development and giving the colonized peoples under the German Empire more autonomy, giving them the know-how into how to manage their own infrastructure and society, and basically relying more on trade than exploitation, which of course we know 90% of the things that Marxists complain about regarding the evils of colonialism, that's literally on the British Empire. 90%.
Let me just make sure I understand. Are you talking about the way the Nazi Germany attempted to integrate other Germanic peoples that they conquered into Nazi Germany?
No. This is the Second Empire. This is the
okay, my bad.
Free.
Gotcha.
No, I think that's right. That point that you made about everybody's hatred of colonialism is really the British model of colonialism, and that's where you see the trick about white identity as well, where it's a means for the British to kind of hide their crimes in the mixture of what other people did. And then you as a person, by identifying that way, now you're taking on the crimes of the British. So we're the Ireland became white now, and then now they have Nigerians beating them up as if the Irish ever had a slave empire.
Right.
You
Or like the Swedes, for example. The Swedish Empire never went beyond Europe, and yet the Swedes are supposed to feel guilty about colonialism around the world when their empire was literally Europe.
Exactly.
Yeah, even in Africa, the French have a pretty strong hold on a lot of the former colonies because they tax them for a lot of the stuff they did in the colonies.
Terrible.
I will say this: there are very strong criticisms of the French Empire, but there's a lot of context that needs to be considered. So, number one, I think French colonialism was a reaction to Britain because Britain was literally conquering the world, and France felt threatened by this because it was only a matter of time until they take over Europe itself. So they said, if we conquer the world before Britain, then we can prevent them from conquering the world, and in doing so, defend France against Britain. In the beginning, you will see actually that the French Empire treated their colonial subjects extremely well. And again, this is because they were very Catholic, whereas the British Empire was Masonic from the start. But then after Napoleon's defeat and the reinstatement of the former revolutionaries and their ideals, France really began to fall to Freemasonry completely. And at some point, Britain and France as empires became indistinguishable, which shows clearly in World War I.
Not only just that, but towards the end of the Spanish Empire, it was de facto basically the French Empire as well. And yeah, that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And what's interesting is that the remnants of that are still very much present in Spain to this day. And this is why a lot of Spaniards very much are self-hating. They want to be French, and it's this very odd situation that most people don't understand the full context of.
Yeah. Spain suffers just as much. I mean, Spain needs to be seen as a product of the Spanish Empire. It's not the Spanish Empire, right? Like it's like the son of the Spanish, just like the other countries, the other republicats of Hispanoamerica are. But they definitely suffer from the Black legend very, very heavily. And yes, Spain today is essentially South France or Southwest England. I think that old Hispano kind of culture, you'll probably find it in like some country town in the mountains and hills of Mexico or Colombia or anywhere else, where there's still kind of that traditional agrarian patriarchal culture is still alive and exists, for better or worse. I wanted to leave you guys with a Spanish writer named Gustavo Bueno, who's actually an atheist, but he calls himself a Catholic atheist. And he's been very influential in the kind of Hispano movement or identity or whatever you want to call this thing. He came up with this concept of the Imperio Depredador and the Imperio Generador, which translates to the depredatory empire and the generative empire. And he talks about
I'm sorry, I just have to interrupt here for a second. These are concepts that I've talked about many times on the shows that I've been on. I've always talked about aggressive empires and defensive empires, and I categorize Britain as an aggressive empire, America as well. A great example of a defensive empire is Imperial Japan. And I've done a lot of historical revisionist documentaries on Imperial Japan. But anyway, I didn't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah. So he kind of contrasts again and empires can switch, right? They can start off depredatory, like you could see like when the Spanish Empire first spread over here through Columbus, it was very much a depredatory situation. But then as Cortez kind of took over the Aztec Empire, this generative aspect kicked in, and you can see it in the evidence of the Spanish Empire throughout Hispanoamerica, where you're going to find, cathedrals and city halls and universities and convents that still stand today that are over 500 years old. And they're all over the place. A lot of people have this meme of the Spanish took the gold, but the gold they actually took throughout the 300 years of the empire is less than what's extracted in Mexico and Peru in 1 year today, to Canadian firms, to give you an example. And then you have to think about all the cost of the infrastructure, the aqueducts, the roads, again, the towns, the universities, all these things that were built that are sprinkled throughout the entire region is kind of an evidence of this kind of generative aspect of this empire. Whereas, you go to India and the remnants of the English Empire, essentially the ports and the railroads that lead to the ports from wherever the raw resources were. So this concept, it is kind of related to the way you were showing, but it's this attitude of like, all empires obviously have to extract something. They have to take something. But it's like not necessarily all of them have a consciousness to leave something behind or to kind of do something. For example, when you were giving me the example of the Germans, and I would think it's Namibia, right?
I can think of Rome as the perfect example of this, actually.
Which one?
The Roman Empire, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really where he gets it from, Gustavo.
And I would also say this: Hernan Cortez, after he had finished conquering Mexico, after he finished conquering, he was very much trying to emulate Rome and saw himself as a legitimate successor of Rome. And what I really find really funny is I had just gotten back on Twitter, and this is going to be basically some of my final thoughts here before we end. What I find interesting is I had these Zoomers, I think, like spamming like these pictures of like Hernan Cortez like fighting an Indian, like this was supposed to be like this own against me. But it's like what I find strange about these young Zoomers who do this, who identify with people like Hernan Cortez, is they're living out this really weird situation online where, because they're so hyper racialized in how they see everything, they miss important facts like, the fact that Hernan, only reason he won against the Mexicas people is because he integrated a lot of Indian tribes into the Spanish Empire. Like 95% of his forces were other tribes that had joined this, Spain. It wasn't like magical white people powers that allowed him to beat the Aztecs. And there's also a situation as well where, like, in terms of like showing that he wasn't a racialist in the slightest, he had many sons. Most of his sons actually were 100% Spanish, with his first wife, I believe. But actually, what was really odd and what's funny that these people don't get is like he actually had a mestizo son, and his mestizo son was his favorite. And he favored his mestizo son so much that his son actually moved back to Spain permanently and became Spanish royalty for the rest of his life. And these people are still a part of Spanish royalty. So it's like, to understand New Spain, the Spanish Empire, and Hispanic history, you have to throw all these racial deductionist ideas that you hear on these podcasts completely out the window, and you have to really look with an open mind.
Was the mother aristocracy as well? Like the aristocrat?
No, she was actually a slave,
I think
which is interesting.
You mix it.
She was a slave for she was a slave for a different Indian tribe before he met up with her.
I think you kind of hold on. You actually mixed it up a little bit.
Or did I mix it up? My bad.
Yeah. So his favorite son, he had with Doña Marina, who's they call her La Malinche, right? She's the translator who was
yes.
That was his favorite girl. Like, he married the Spanish girl because like he had to, for like political reasons, but like he loved the Indian girl. And his favorite son, Martin, the mestizo, was actually a page to Emperor Philip II. And he received an education at the University of Salamanca, which would be the equivalent of Harvard or something. And he was actually in the Order of Santiago, which is a military order, which would be the equivalent of like special forces today, right? So he was a highly trained, highly educated kind of soldier. He eventually was executed in New Spain because the first generation of conquistadors were kind of mad that now we can't like run things the way we used to, because now like the emperor has sent a viceroy, and they kind of rebelled, and he ended up getting killed because of it. Yet, the titles were still kind of recognized. And Cortez, though he died in Spain, he asked to have his body buried in Mexico. If you read some of Cortez's writings, he was very much aware of the phenomenon he kicked off, where this kind of like new race, if you will, even though he wasn't using those terms, like this new civilization, this kind of marriage between the Native American and the Spanish was going to like dawn something new. He really understood that. It's really interesting. But I think you mix it with the children of Montezuma. So
that's what I had mixed up. Yep.
Montezuma was the emperor of the Aztec Empire who sadly was killed by his own people because they were pissed off that he didn't reject the Spanish as well as he should have. But his children were all the nobles were recognized, and his children were educated, and eventually they moved to Spain. I think right around the time of independence. One of the things that most people think is that the independence movements were kind of a racial thing, but the independence movements were really a civil war, and most Indians and freed blacks of prominence were actually with the crown. They fought for the crown against the rebels.
Although you had people of all races on both sides, just to be
you did, but overwhelmingly, the Indians and the freed blacks fought on the side of the crown.
Absolutely. And Indian villages in Latin America are where you're going to find the most traditional people that don't tolerate things like LGBTQ shit that they try to push on the rest of Latin America.
Yeah, that's where you definitely still find that kind of more of, again, medieval ideal. But yes, Montezuma's heirs, they still have royal title in Spain, and they're still alive. And it's kind of funny. A couple of years ago, AMLO, the president of Mexico, was saying that Spain should apologize or something. And Montezuma's heir, who still looks very much like a Native American, but he's like a Spaniard Native American, he's like, this guy's a fucking idiot. Like, yeah, there's sad things in war, but ultimately, like, everything that's happened in history, amongst us is a good thing. Like, we were ripping people's hearts out. We were like farming, slaves so we can bring them to a pyramid to be sacrificed. Like, that wasn't anything high, that wasn't anything good. And
like, so Indians would wake up under the Aztec Empire, like, worried, like, is today the day that I'm just going to be ripped out of my bed and just be sacrificed to like a sun god?
Right. So, yeah. I just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and get ready to end it. Is there anything else anybody else wants to say?
I think the lesson here, I just want to say this to conclude. The lesson here is that really a lot of the issues that we're dealing with today is really we can put people down into two camps. The cultured peoples versus the liberal peoples. That's what it is. It's the cultured versus the liberals. That's it.
I like that. That's good.
Is that everything?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm thinking
What
it
I-
is.
yeah. What I wanted to say was man, I definitely find some of the things that you guys say annoying, but I definitely really appreciate hearing it, and I like talking about it and figuring out where we disagree and where we agree. So, like, I hope we can talk more in the future. That's for certain.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree as well. I was told by our host here, Zolt, that we would have a lot of disagreements on certain things, but I guess maybe we just didn't address those things. But based on what we talked about here today, it really seems like I agree with almost everything you guys said.
I mean, most of the disagreements is probably if we talked more about National Socialism or Protestantism, it would probably be more disagreements there.
Yeah, like when the Protestantism was getting bring up, I was like, okay,
because you are a Protestant, but
yeah.
Yeah, and I can understand that. For final thoughts, I'd just like to say that, I think obviously Hispanics are, even though they've always existed in a sense in the U.S., they are a new phenomenon for most, white Americans, for lack of a better term. And, there's a lot of ignorance or unknown. There's a lot of, obviously, the kind of Black legend promotion through American education, which makes total sense. But I think also what's happened a lot is white America, again, for lack of a better term, has begun to meet and make friends with Hispanics either at work and get to actually know these people more intimately. And my impression is that overall, like, those interactions are actually good and positive. Like that's kind of what I've heard, both from Hispanic point of view and from American point of view. But I think, getting to know more of our history, historical development, more from our writers, right? Like if the person writing the book has an English or a Jewish last name, then it's like, I don't know if you want to waste your time reading that book. Like, read a book with somebody whose last name ends with an EZ. And I think it might lead to a better understanding of who we are. And because of that, we can have a more fruitful dialogue and discussion, even if there's disagreements. But I think the ultimate goal here is like, look, we share this continent. We're neighbors to each other. There's no reason why we should have like deep-rooted animosity or resentment. Like, we should be able to, live peaceably, like just like we do in a neighborhood, and that's ultimately my goal. And that goes just as true for Anglo-Saxons and Afro-Saxons, so I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, and I want to just say this before I'm done as well, is Zoltanous and the rest of you guys on the panel, I want to personally commend all of you for being some of the only people in your essentially sort of sphere of the internet and Telegram and YouTube who, actually decided, hey, let's talk to these people. Let's have a dialogue. Let's actually just be real with each other about where we disagree and where we kind of see things the way they've been going in the Western Hemisphere. Most people, the Black and the white nationalists, generally speaking, don't want to do this with us. They just want to make up lies, to their audience about what we actually believe in. And you guys definitely deserve some credit here, absolutely, for just having an open and honest conversation. And yeah, we should treat each other like neighbors because, the white people are going to be on this continent forever, essentially North America. And so are Hispanics. And we're going to have to work out something with each other. And it's better that, we just shoot the shit and just talk straight up and we don't bullshit with each other. Instead of trying to convince Hispanics that they're white or they're Black or play these games of just this phony one struggle that a lot of these people push that isn't legit. But yeah, I commend all of you. And I think we had a really fruitful discussion here today.
I totally agree.
Well, thanks. Do you have anything to say, Giovanni? He's been muted most of the conversation. Oh,
they're going to be on. Me and Arjun are going to be on soon to talk about futurism. I just mostly listen like Guillermo and Noel talk this episode. But my final thoughts would be reject white identity. It's a fake identity. Connect with your real European roots. Med supremacy. Crush the Anglo scourge. North America should have been Spanish, French, and Catholic. Crush the Anglo scourge.
And German.
No, fuck the crowds.
Actually, I wanted to comment a little on the. I think it was one of the two here, one of the two guests here that said, read a book that's written by someone with a last name Easy, not a Anglo or a Jew. I've encountered that problem recently as well in the revisionist community. A lot of people keep citing David Irving and David Cole, of course, an Anglo and a Jew when it comes to certain aspects, and I vehemently disagree with these two people. But it's really tiresome that they always cite, English and Jewish revisionists when it comes to German history. It just drives me insane because I find that they never tell 100% of the full truth. It's like, well, how can you listen to someone that, that has a vested interest in not presenting the full truth because, well, his nation and people have been an enemy to Germany for centuries.
You could be like Tick and just say it's in Britain's interest to make sure Germany doesn't do well.
Right. Exactly. And it's tiresome. I'm sick and tired of the Germanophobia that's just clearly present in the Anglo-Saxon culture.
Yeah.
Crowdophobe.
I guess that's everything. And
cool. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me, man.
Next
It was good. I really enjoyed the conversation. Looking forward to it. Hopefully we'll get to round 2 at some point.
Definitely.
Right. Yeah, definitely.